14-year-old smiled during trial for killing grandparents. Then the judge made history. 14-year-old Marcus Chen sat in that courtroom and did something that made a veteran prosecutor physically shake with anger. When they showed him photos of his grandparents' final moments, the two people who had sacrificed everything to give him a home, he yawned, then smiled, then looked directly at their grieving family members and mouthed the words they deserved. A woman in the gallery screamed. Two bailiffs had to hold back the victim's brother from jumping the barrier. The defense attorney literally put his head in his hands, but Marcus, he just kept smiling, because he genuinely believed that at 14 years old, the system couldn't touch him, that his age was a get-out-of-jail-free card, that by his 21st birthday, he'd be free. He had no idea that the judge sitting above him had lost her own parents to violence, and she was about to make absolutely certain that Marcus Chen's smile would be the last thing he ever got to enjoy. Stories like this test everything we believe about justice and mercy. If you want to see how this ends, subscribe now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. This is how it all began. Nobody saw it coming. Not the neighbors who watched Marcus mow his grandparents' lawn every Saturday. Not the school counselor who said he was adjusting well. Not even the detective who would later call this the most disturbing case of his 30-year career. Because Marcus wasn't some troubled kid acting out. He was something far more terrifying. He was patient, calculated, and completely aware of exactly what he was doing. For 8 months, he lived under his grandparents' roof, ate their food, let them hug him goodnight, all while searching online for one specific thing: minimum sentence for juvenile offenders, and can a 14-year-old get life in prison? He wasn't wondering if he'd get caught. He was planning for it. And on the night of February 19th, when his grandmother woke up and saw him standing in her doorway, the last words she ever heard were, "You should have left me in foster care." The Superior Court of San Mateo County had seen its share of difficult cases: gang violence, domestic tragedies, crimes that left even seasoned attorneys needing a moment before they could speak. But nothing had prepared that courtroom for Marcus Chen. He entered through the side door at exactly 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, flanked by two bailiffs who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his narrow frame. His wrists were cuffed in front of him, the chain clinking softly with each step. And despite everything, despite the charges, despite the families filling the gallery, despite the weight of what was about to happen, Marcus was smiling. Not the nervous smile of someone scared and trying to hide it. Not the confused smile of a child who doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. This was different. This was the smile of someone who thought they knew something everyone else didn't. His public defender, a woman named Rebecca Santos with 15 years of experience, had already told the prosecutor that her client was uncooperative and disturbing. She'd requested a psychological evaluation 3 times. Each time, Marcus had passed. No diagnosable mental illness, no psychotic breaks, no trauma-induced dissociation. He was, according to every expert who examined him, fully aware of reality. He just didn't care about it the way most people did. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, standing room only. People lined the walls, pressed shoulder to shoulder, all of them waiting to see the boy who had done the unthinkable. In the front row sat Marcus's aunt, his grandmother's sister, a woman named Helen Park, who had flown in from Seattle the moment she heard. Her eyes were red and swollen. Her hands gripped a folded tissue so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Next to her sat her husband and 2 adult children, all of them staring at Marcus with expressions that ranged from disbelief to pure hatred. Marcus glanced at them once as he took his seat. Then he looked away, bored. Judge Patricia Hawthorne was already at the bench, reviewing documents with the kind of focus that made attorneys nervous. She was 58 years old, a former prosecutor who had been appointed to the juvenile division 6 years earlier. She had a reputation for being firm but fair, someone who believed in rehabilitation when possible but never at the expense of public safety. Her short gray hair was pulled back neatly. Her reading glasses sat low on her nose. And when she finally looked up and saw Marcus smiling at her, something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, a tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible press of her lips. But the court reporter noticed, and she would later testify about it. The bailiff called the court to order. Everyone stood, then sat. The room settled into that particular kind of silence that only exists in courtrooms. Heavy, expectant, thick with unspoken emotion. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Jessica Brennan, stood and approached the podium. She didn't look at Marcus. Not yet. She addressed the judge directly, her voice steady and professional. "Your Honor, the people are ready to proceed with the arraignment in the matter of the state versus Marcus James Chen. The defendant is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including murder of persons over the age of 65 and murder during the commission of a robbery. The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus shifted in his seat, not uncomfortably, more like a kid adjusting himself during a long assembly. His legs started bouncing slightly under the table. His attorney placed a hand on his forearm, a silent message to stay still. He stopped for about 10 seconds. Then the bouncing started again. A juror in the second row, a middle-aged man in a blue sweater, watched this and frowned. Another juror, a younger woman with dark curly hair, looked away entirely, focusing instead on her notepad. They hadn't even heard the evidence yet, but body language was already telling a story, and Marcus seemed completely oblivious to what that story was saying about him. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the bench. She looked at Marcus directly for the first time. "Mr. Chen, do you understand the charges that have been read against you?" Her voice was firm, clear, the kind of voice that expected an answer. Marcus glanced at his attorney. Rebecca nodded. He looked back at the judge and said in a voice that sounded almost cheerful, "Yes, ma'am." Someone in the gallery made a sound, half gasp, half sob. The judge's expression didn't change. She simply made a note on the paper in front of her. Then she said something that made the entire room go still. "Let the record reflect that the defendant smiled while acknowledging the charges." The court reporter's fingers flew across the keys. Marcus's smile finally flickered, just for a second. Then it came back, wider than before. The arraignment continued. Plea entered, not guilty. Trial date set, 6 weeks. Bail denied, as expected. Marcus would remain in juvenile detention until the proceedings concluded. The whole process took less than 20 minutes. But in that 20 minutes, everyone in that courtroom learned something crucial. This wasn't going to be a normal case. This wasn't going to be about a child who made a terrible mistake. This was going to be about something much darker, something that made people question what they thought they knew about innocence and age and the capacity for evil. And Marcus Chen, still smiling as the bailiffs led him away, had no idea that he'd just set something in motion that he couldn't stop. The judge watched him leave. Then she closed her folder, and in the silence that followed, someone whispered what everyone was thinking. "What is wrong with that kid?" The house at 847 Maple Ridge Drive looked like every other house on the block. Single-story ranch style, pale yellow siding, a small front porch with 2 rocking chairs that hadn't been sat in for years. The lawn was always trimmed. The mailbox was always emptied. Christmas lights went up the day after Thanksgiving and came down the first week of January. It was the kind of house that blended into the neighborhood so completely that most people would struggle to describe it even if they passed it every day. And that was exactly how James and Linda Chen liked it. Quiet, predictable, safe. James Chen was 72 years old when he died. He'd worked for 38 years as an electrician before retiring at 65 with a modest pension and enough savings to live comfortably. He was the kind of man who fixed things, not just electrical panels and broken outlets, but relationships, problems, anything that needed patience and careful attention. His wife Linda used to joke that he'd never met a project he couldn't solve with enough time and the right tools. He wore the same style of flannel shirts year-round. He drank his coffee black. He watched the evening news religiously and fell asleep in his recliner more nights than he'd ever admit. He wasn't particularly talkative, but when he spoke, people listened, because James Chen didn't waste words. Linda Chen was 68. She'd been an elementary school teacher for 32 years before retiring to focus on what she called the good part of life: gardening, book clubs, and spoiling her grandchildren. She had a laugh that could fill a room and a habit of humming while she cooked. Every Sunday, she made enough food for a small army, even though it was usually just her and James eating. She kept photo albums organized by year and event. She sent birthday cards that always arrived exactly on time. And she believed, deeply and without question, that family was everything, that blood mattered, that you didn't abandon people just because things got hard. It was that belief that would ultimately cost her everything. Their son, David Chen, had struggled most of his adult life. Addiction issues that started in his 20s and never really stopped. Failed jobs, failed relationships, a pattern of promises made and broken so many times that eventually people stopped believing them. When David's son Marcus was born, James and Linda had hoped it would be the wake-up call their son needed. For a while it seemed to work. David got clean, stayed clean for almost 3 years, but then Marcus's mother left, and David spiraled harder than he ever had before. By the time Marcus turned 12, Child Protective Services had been called 4 times. The final time, they didn't just investigate, they removed Marcus from the home entirely. James and Linda didn't hesitate. They were already in their late 60s, an age when most people were enjoying retirement and grandparent visits, not taking on full-time custody of a preteen. But but they appeared in family court. The same week, Marcus was removed and filed for emergency guardianship. The judge approved it within 10 days. Marcus moved into their spare bedroom, the one Linda had been using for her sewing projects, on a Tuesday afternoon in September. He arrived with 2 garbage bags of clothes and a backpack. No toys, no books, nothing that suggested a childhood. James had carried the bags inside while Linda showed Marcus his new room. She'd already bought him new sheets. Blue, because she remembered he used to like blue. She'd cleared space in the closet, put fresh towels in the bathroom, made his favorite dinner, spaghetti with garlic bread. She wanted him to feel welcome, to feel safe, to know that this time things would be different. For the first few months, it seemed to be working. Marcus went to school without complaint, did his homework at the kitchen table while Linda cooked dinner, helped James rake leaves on Saturday mornings. He was quiet, which they expected. Adjusting to a new home takes time, especially for a kid who'd been through what Marcus had been through. The school counselor called once a month with updates. Grades were acceptable. No behavioral issues. No red flags. Marcus had even made a friend, a kid named Tyler who lived 3 streets over. They played video games together after school sometimes. Linda would make them snacks and listen to them laugh from the other room, and she'd smile to herself, thinking that maybe, finally, things were going to be okay. Maybe they'd gotten through to him. Maybe love and stability were enough. But there were small things, moments that didn't quite fit. The way Marcus never said thank you unless prompted. The way he'd watch them sometimes when he thought they weren't looking, his expression blank and unreadable. The time Linda found him going through her purse and he'd claimed he was looking for gum, even though he knew where the gum was kept. The night James woke up at 2 in the morning and found Marcus standing in the hallway, just standing there in the dark, staring at nothing. When James asked what was wrong, Marcus had said nothing and gone back to his room without another word. James mentioned it to Linda the next morning. She'd brushed it off. Nightmares, probably. Trauma did strange things to kids. They just needed to be patient. The neighbors noticed things too, though they wouldn't talk about it until after. How Marcus never smiled when his grandparents were around, but smiled plenty when they weren't. How he'd sometimes sit on the front steps for hours, doing nothing, just watching cars go by with an expression that one neighbor described as empty. How there'd been shouting coming from the house a few weeks before it happened. Marcus's voice, loud and angry, saying something nobody could quite make out, followed by Linda's voice, quiet, pleading. The next day, Linda had waved at that same neighbor and said everything was fine, just a disagreement about screen time, normal teenage stuff. The neighbor had nodded and smiled and gone back inside, pushing away the uncomfortable feeling that something wasn't right. James and Linda Chen went to bed on the night of February 18th, believing they were safe in their own home. They locked the front door, like always, set the alarm, like always. James fell asleep in less than 5 minutes, like always. Linda read for a little while, a mystery novel she'd been working through, before turning off her lamp at 10:30. Down the hall, Marcus's light was still on. She'd stopped telling him when to go to sleep months ago. Pick your battles, the counselor had said. As long as he's getting up for school, let him have some control over his schedule. So she did. She closed her eyes. She thought about the grocery list she needed to make tomorrow. She thought about calling her sister this weekend. She thought about normal things, safe things, and she had no idea that in 3.5 hours she would wake up for the last time. That the boy sleeping down the hall had already decided she wasn't going to see another sunrise. That safety was an illusion, and that evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it just waits. The first 911 call came in at 6:42 in the morning. A neighbor named Patricia Gonzalez, who lived directly across the street from the Chen residence, had noticed something unusual. The newspaper was still on the driveway. The porch light was still on, and James Chen's car was in the same spot it had been the night before, which meant he hadn't left for his morning walk. James walked every morning at 6:15 without fail. Rain or shine, summer or winter, he'd be out there in his windbreaker and sneakers, doing his 2-mile loop around the neighborhood. Patricia had lived across from the Chens for 9 years. She knew their routines better than she knew her own. And when James didn't appear by 6:30, something in her gut told her to pay attention. She'd tried calling their house phone first. It rang 8 times before going to voicemail. She'd waited 10 minutes, then tried again. Same result. That's when she'd walked across the street and knocked on the front door. No answer. She'd peered through the front window, cupping her hands against the glass to see past the curtains. Everything looked normal, neat, undisturbed, but there was a stillness to the house that felt wrong, like the air inside had stopped moving. She'd knocked again, louder this time, and called out their names. Nothing. That's when she'd pulled out her phone and dialed 911, feeling slightly foolish but unable to shake the certainty that something was very, very wrong. Officer Derek Martinez arrived arrived at 6:53. He was a 10-year veteran of the San Mateo Police Department, someone who'd responded to thousands of wellness checks over the course of his career. Most of them turned out to be nothing: a dead phone battery, a hearing aid turned off, someone sleeping too deeply to hear the door. He approached the house with professional caution but no real alarm. He knocked, identified himself, waited, knocked again, harder, still nothing. He walked around to the back door, checking windows as he went. Everything was locked. Everything looked secure. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no disturbed soil in the garden beds, just a quiet house on a quiet street on a Tuesday morning. He was about to radio in and request permission to enter when he noticed the back door. It wasn't locked. The handle turned easily under his hand. That was the first red flag. James Chen locked everything. Patricia Gonzalez had mentioned that specifically when she'd called. "He's the kind of man who checks the locks twice before bed," she'd said. "Officer," Martinez pushed the door open slowly, calling out as he entered. "Police, is anyone home? Mr. Chen? Mrs. Chen?" His voice echoed through the empty kitchen. The coffee maker was full and cold. 2 mugs sat on the counter, unused. A dish towel hung neatly over the oven handle. Everything was exactly where it should be, except for the people. He moved through the kitchen into the living room. The television was off. The remote sat on the arm of James's recliner. A folded newspaper from the day before rested on the coffee table. Officer Martinez's hand moved to his weapon, though he didn't draw it. Not yet. Something about the silence felt deliberate, heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. He called out again. No response. He moved down the hallway, his boots making soft sounds on the carpet. There were 3 doors. One open, a bathroom, empty. One closed, what looked like a guest bedroom or office, and one at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, with darkness visible beyond it. Officer Martinez pushed the door open with his foot, keeping his hand on his weapon. Then he stopped. His training kicked in automatically. Secure the scene, check for threats, call for backup. But for just a second he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was seeing, because James and Linda Chen were in their bed, positioned as if they'd simply fallen asleep. Linda on the left side, her reading glasses still on the nightstand. James on the right, one arm draped over his chest. They looked peaceful, almost serene, except for the blood, and the fact that neither of them was breathing, and the fact that the room smelled like something Officer Martinez would never be able to forget, no matter how many years passed. He backed out immediately, his hand already reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Martinez. I need backup and medical at 847 Maple Ridge Drive. 2 victims, both deceased, possible homicide. Secure the scene and notify detectives." His voice was steady, professional, but his hands were shaking. He'd seen death before: traffic accidents, overdoses, one particularly brutal domestic incident that still gave him nightmares. But this was different. This felt calculated, deliberate. There was no chaos here, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or defensive wounds, just 2 elderly people who'd been eliminated in their sleep by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Within 15 minutes, the quiet street was flooded with emergency vehicles, patrol cars, an ambulance that wouldn't be needed, unmarked detective vehicles. Crime scene tape went up. Neighbors came out onto their porches, some still in bathrobes, all of them staring in disbelief. Patricia Gonzalez stood on her lawn with tears streaming down her face, telling anyone who would listen that she'd known something was wrong, that she'd felt it. A young couple from 2 houses down held each other and whispered. An older man who'd been friends with James for years simply sat on his front steps with his head in his hands. The house at 847 Maple Ridge Drive, which had spent decades blending seamlessly into the neighborhood, had suddenly become the only address that mattered. Detective Sarah Kovach arrived at 728. She was a 12-year veteran of the Homicide Division, someone who'd built a reputation for being thorough, methodical, and impossible to rattle. She ducked under the crime scene tape and was briefed by Officer Martinez before entering the house. She listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, taking mental notes. Then she put on gloves, booties, and stepped inside. She moved through the house the same way Martinez had, observing everything, touching nothing: the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, and finally, the bedroom. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her trained eyes cataloging every detail: the position of the bodies, the entry wounds, the lack of defensive injuries, the undisturbed bedding. And then she noticed something that made her pause. There was a chair in the corner of the bedroom, a small wooden chair from the kitchen table. It had been moved, deliberately positioned, angled so that whoever sat in it would have a clear view of the bed. Detective Kovach photographed it from 3 different angles. Then she noticed the carpet beneath it, slight compression marks, as if someone had been sitting there for a while, not moving, just sitting, watching. She felt something cold settle in her stomach, because whoever did this hadn't just killed killed these people. They'd stayed afterward. They'd sat in the dark and looked at what they'd done. And that told Detective Kovach everything she needed to know about the kind of person she was looking for. This wasn't rage. This wasn't panic. This was something much worse. This was someone who wanted to see the results of their work. Someone who found satisfaction in it. Someone who might even have enjoyed it. She stepped back into the hallway and pulled out her phone. She needed the medical examiner. She needed forensics. And she needed to know where the grandson was. Right now. Marcus Chen was located at 7:51 in the morning, approximately 2 hours after the bodies were discovered. Officer Jennifer Huang spotted him 3 blocks from the house, walking along Cedar Street with his hands in his hoodie pockets and earbuds in his ears. She'd been driving a standard patrol route when the radio call came through. All units advised to be on the lookout for a 14-year-old male, approximately 5'4", last seen wearing dark clothing, possible witness or person of interest in a double homicide. When Officer Huang saw Marcus walking casually down the sidewalk like he was heading to school on any normal day, she felt her pulse quicken. She pulled the cruiser alongside him and rolled down her window. Marcus didn't run. He didn't even look surprised. He pulled out one earbud and looked at her with mild curiosity, the way someone might acknowledge a stranger asking for directions. Officer Huang kept her voice calm and professional. "Hey there, are you Marcus Chen?" He nodded. "Yeah." No hesitation, no nervousness, just a simple confirmation. She asked him to stop walking for a moment. He complied immediately, standing on the sidewalk with perfect posture, waiting. She stepped out of the vehicle, her hand resting near her belt, but not on her weapon. "Can you tell me where you're coming from this morning?" Marcus shrugged one shoulder. "Just walking, couldn't sleep." His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script he'd already memorized. Officer Huang radioed her location and requested backup before continuing the conversation. She needed to keep him talking until detectives arrived. "Marcus, I need to ask you something important. When's the last time you saw your grandparents?" He looked at her directly, and that's when she noticed his eyes. Not frightened, not confused, just blank, like looking into a house with no lights on. "Last night, before bed." "Why?" The question came out with just enough inflection to sound innocent, but Officer Huang had been doing this job long enough to recognize performance when she saw it. She told him there'd been an incident at the house, that they needed him to come down to the station to answer some questions. He asked if he was in trouble. She said no. They just needed his help understanding what happened. He said okay, just like that. Okay. The backup unit arrived within 3 minutes. Officer Martinez, the same officer who'd discovered the bodies. He recognized Marcus immediately from family photos he'd seen inside the house. When Marcus saw Martinez approaching, something flickered across his face. Not fear, something closer to recognition, like an actor spotting another performer. Martinez asked if Marcus would be willing to come with them voluntarily. No cuffs, just to talk. Marcus agreed without asking a single question. Not, "Is everyone okay?" Not, "What happened?" Not, "Are my grandparents hurt?" Nothing. He simply walked to the patrol car, climbed into the back seat, and buckled his seatbelt. Officer Huang exchanged a look with Martinez over the roof of the vehicle. They were both thinking the same thing. This wasn't right. None of this was right. During the drive to the station, Officer Huang's body camera captured everything. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, looking out the window at the passing neighborhood. His expression never changed. He didn't fidget, didn't ask questions, didn't show any of the normal signs of stress or anxiety that even innocent people display when they're unexpectedly questioned by police. At one point, Martinez tried to engage him in conversation. "How's school going, Marcus?" A pause. Then, "Fine." Another question. "You doing okay back there?" Another pause. "Yeah." Nothing more. Just single-word responses delivered in that same flat tone that made both officers' instincts scream that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this kid. They arrived at the station at 8:15. Marcus was escorted to an interview room, not an interrogation room, not yet, because he hadn't been charged with anything and was technically still a minor in need of protection. The room was small but not uncomfortable. A table, 4 chairs, a camera in the corner. Officer Huang asked if he wanted water or something to eat. He said water would be good. She brought him a bottle and told him someone would be with him shortly. He thanked her. Actually said thank you, with perfect politeness, like he'd been reminded by a parent to mind his manners. Then he sat down, opened the water bottle, and took a long drink, and waited. Detective Kovach arrived 20 minutes later with her partner, Detective Michael Torres. They'd come straight from the crime scene. They hadn't slept. They'd barely had coffee. And they were about to sit across from a 14-year-old boy and try to determine if he was a traumatized witness or something much darker. Kovach carried a thin folder with preliminary notes. Torres carried a recorder. They entered the room together, introduced themselves, and asked Marcus if he understood why he was there. He said yes. They asked if he was okay with answering some questions. He said yes. They informed him that because he was a minor, they'd already contacted his emergency contact, his Aunt Helen, and she was on her way from the airport. He nodded. No emotion, no reaction, just acknowledgement. Detective Kovach started with soft questions. When did you last see your grandparents? What time did you go to bed? Did you hear anything unusual during the night? Marcus answered each question with minimal detail. He'd seen them around 9, gone to bed around 11, slept through everything, woke up early, went for a walk. Standard answers. Believable answers. Except for one problem. When Kovach asked him why he'd gone for a walk so early, he said he couldn't sleep. When she asked why he couldn't sleep, he said he didn't know, just couldn't. And when she asked if he'd noticed anything different about the house when he left, he said no. Everything was normal. The lights were off, the doors were locked, everything was quiet. But here's what Marcus didn't know. The forensics team had already determined that the back door had been unlocked from the inside, that there were fresh shoe prints in the dirt near the back steps, that the prints matched a specific type of sneaker, and when Detective Torres glanced down at Marcus's feet, he saw them. The exact same sneakers, navy blue with white soles, still slightly dirty around the edges. Torres made a note without saying anything. Kovach continued asking questions, her tone remaining gentle, non-accusatory. She asked Marcus about his relationship with his grandparents. He said it was fine. She asked if they ever argued. He said, sometimes, but nothing serious. She asked what they argued about. He paused for the first time, then said, normal stuff. Rules, curfew, they wanted to control everything. The word control hung in the air like smoke. Kovach and Torres both registered it, wrote it down. Then Kovach asked the most important question so far. Marcus, did you love your grandparents? Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus looked at the table, then at the wall, then back at Kovach. And when he finally answered, his voice had changed. Not sad, not grief-stricken, just irritated. I guess they were okay. They gave me a place to live. Not, I loved them. Not, they were amazing. Just, they were okay. They gave me a place to live. Like they were landlords. Like their only value was transactional. Detective Kovach kept her expression neutral. But inside, every alarm bell she had was ringing, because she'd interviewed hundreds of people in her career. Guilty people. Innocent people. Traumatized people. And she'd never heard someone describe their murdered family members as okay. Detective Torres leaned forward slightly. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything you want to tell us? Anything at all that might help us understand what happened? Marcus looked at him. Really looked at him. And for just a second, something passed across his face. Not guilt, not fear. Something almost like amusement. Like he knew a joke that nobody else had figured out yet. Then it was gone. His expression went blank again, and he said, in that same flat voice, no, I don't know anything. I was asleep. Detective Kovach closed her folder. She thanked him for his cooperation, told him they'd be right back, and as she and Torres stepped into the hallway, she said quietly, we need to test his hands. Now. The gunshot residue test was administered at 9:37 in the morning. Marcus was informed that it was a standard procedure, something they did with everyone who'd been in or near the house. He was told it wouldn't hurt, that it would only take a few minutes, and that it would help them eliminate him as a suspect, so they could focus on finding whoever was responsible. Marcus listened to all of this without expression. Then he held out his hands, palms up, and waited. The forensic technician, a woman named Dr. Angela Ross, who'd been doing this work for 16 years, swabbed his palms, the backs of his hands, and the cuffs of his hoodie sleeves. She worked methodically, placing each swab in a separate evidence bag, labeling them with time stamps and initials. Marcus watched the whole process with what could only be described as clinical interest, like he was studying her technique. Dr. Ross had tested hundreds of people over her career. She'd seen every reaction imaginable, nervous laughter, trembling hands, angry protests, quiet tears, but she'd never seen someone watch the process with the detached curiosity of a student observing a science experiment. When she finished, Marcus pulled his hands back and asked, how long until you get results? It was the first unprompted question he'd asked all morning. Dr. Ross told him it typically took a few hours for preliminary results. He nodded slowly, then asked another question. Is it accurate? She paused at that, looked at him. Very accurate. Why do you ask? He shrugged. Just curious. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes were calculating something. The preliminary results came back at 11:15. Dr. Ross called Detective Kovach directly, bypassing the usual protocol of sending a written report first. Her voice was tight when she spoke. You need to see this now. Kovach and Torres met her in the forensics lab on the 3rd floor. Dr. Ross had the results printed out and highlighted. She pointed to the key findings without preamble. Barium aluminum, antimony, lead, all three trace elements that indicate recent exposure to gunshot residue, present on both palms, present on the inner surfaces of both sleeves, present in concentrations that suggested direct contact, not environmental transfer. He fired a weapon, Dr. Ross said quietly. Within the last 12 hours, there's no question. Detective Torres felt his jaw tighten. He'd been hoping they were wrong, hoping that Marcus was just a traumatized kid with poor emotional responses and bad timing. But hope didn't matter anymore. Evidence mattered, and the evidence was screaming. Kovach asked about potential contamination or false positives. Dr. Ross shook her head. The distribution pattern is consistent with someone holding and firing a handgun, both hands, multiple discharges. This wasn't incidental contact. This was active use. She pulled up photos of the swab samples on her computer screen, showed them the concentrations, explained the science in terms they could use in court, and then she said something that made both detectives go cold. I've been doing this for 16 years. I've never seen a 14-year-old test positive like this. Not once. While the GSR results were being processed, the forensics team at the house had been conducting their own investigation. They'd found the weapon at 1043, hidden in a location that demonstrated both planning and familiarity with the property. It was in the garage, tucked behind a box of Christmas decorations on a high shelf, wrapped in a black t-shirt that preliminary analysis suggested belonged to Marcus. The weapon itself was a 9mm handgun registered to James Chen, purchased legally 8 years earlier for home protection and kept in a locked safe in the master bedroom closet. The safe had been opened, not forced, opened with the combination, and the only people who knew that combination were James, Linda, and Marcus, who'd been given the information 6 months earlier in case of emergency. Ballistics confirmed it within 2 hours. The weapon recovered from the garage was a definitive match for the bullets recovered from both victims. Rifling patterns, firing pin impressions, ejector marks. Every microscopic detail aligned perfectly. This was the murder weapon. No doubt, no margin for error. The gun that had ended 2 lives had been handled by someone who knew where it was kept, how to access it, and where to hide it afterward. And that person's fingerprints were all over it. Not smudged, not partial, full, clear prints on the grip, the trigger guard, and the magazine. Marcus Chen's prints, confirmed by comparison to his juvenile records from a previous truancy incident 2 years earlier. But the evidence didn't stop there. The digital forensics team had seized Marcus's phone from his bedroom at 8:30 that morning. Standard procedure in any investigation involving a minor. They'd expected to find typical teenage content, social media, games, text conversations. What they found instead was a search history that read like a premeditation checklist. Searches conducted over the past 6 weeks, some deleted but recoverable through forensic software. How long does gunshot residue stay on hands? Can police trace bullets to a specific gun? Minimum sentence for minors convicted of murder. What happens to juveniles who kill family members? Do courts show leniency for age? Each search was time-stamped, documented, undeniable. Detective Kovach sat in her office reviewing the phone records with Torres standing behind her, reading over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Torres said what they were both thinking. He was planning this. Kovach nodded slowly. For weeks, maybe longer. She scrolled through the search history again, her stomach turning with each new entry. There was one search that particularly disturbed her. It had been conducted 3 days before the murders. Just 3 words. Do people suffer? No context, no follow-up, just that simple, chilling question typed into a search engine at 11:30 at night while his grandparents slept down the hall. What kind of 14-year-old search is that? What kind of child lies in bed wondering about suffering and then acts on that curiosity? The surveillance footage came in at 1:45 in the afternoon. A neighbor 2 houses down had a security camera system that captured a portion of the street, including a partial view of the Chen driveway. The footage was grainy, shot in night vision mode, but it was enough. At 3:12 in the morning on February 19th, a figure emerged from the Chen house through the front door. Small frame, wearing a dark hoodie, moving with purpose but not panic. The figure walked down the driveway, paused at the street, looked both ways as if checking for cars, then walked out of frame heading east. The timestamp was crucial. 3:12, more than 3 hours before Marcus claimed to have woken up and gone for a walk. More than 3 hours before he was found by Officer Huang. He hadn't been taking an early morning stroll. He'd been outside since the middle of the night, and now they knew why. The medical examiner's preliminary report arrived at 2:30. Time of death for both victims was estimated between 2:45 and 3:15 4:15 in the morning. The report noted that both victims had been deceased for several hours by the time they were discovered. Both had been shot while sleeping. Neither showed signs of waking or defending themselves. The angles of entry suggested the shooter had been standing at close range, firing from a position near the foot of the bed. Execution style, the report noted clinically. No hesitation marks, no evidence of struggle. Clean, deliberate shots placed with enough accuracy to be immediately fatal. The examiner added a personal note at the bottom, something rarely included in official reports. In 23 years, I've never seen a crime scene this methodical from someone this young. Detective Kovac compiled everything into a single file. The GSR results, the weapon, the prints, the phone records, the surveillance footage, the medical examiner's findings. She laid it all out on her desk and stared at it. In her 12 years as a homicide detective, she'd built cases on far less evidence. She'd gone to trial with circumstantial fragments and witness testimony and hoped it would be enough. But this wasn't fragments. This was a complete picture. This was a 14-year-old boy who had planned, executed, and attempted to cover up a double homicide with a level of calculation that most adult criminals couldn't achieve. And the most disturbing part wasn't just that he'd done it, it was that he'd almost pulled it off. If not for the GSR test, if not for the security camera, if not for that one neighbor who knew James Chen's routine well enough to call 911, Marcus might have walked away from this. He might have played the traumatized victim, might have cried at the funeral, might have inherited the house and lived there alone until he turned 18. The thought made Kovac physically ill. She called the district attorney's office at 3 o'clock, spoke directly to Jessica Brennan, the chief prosecutor for major crimes, laid out the evidence piece by piece. Brennan listened without interrupting. When Kovac finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Brennan said, "Charge him. 2 counts. First-degree murder with special circumstances. I'll handle the press. You handle the arrest." Kovac hung up and looked at Torres. "Let's go." They walked down to the interview room where Marcus had been waiting for hours. He looked up when they entered, and for the first time all day, he looked slightly concerned. Not scared, just concerned, like someone who'd just realized they might have made a miscalculation. Detective Kovac read him his rights, told him he was being placed under arrest. And as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, real handcuffs this time, not the courtesy of voluntary cooperation, Marcus finally asked the question he should have asked that morning: "Are they really dead?" The psychological evaluation was ordered by the court 3 days after Marcus's arrest. It was standard procedure in any case involving a juvenile defendant facing adult charges. The goal was to assess mental competency, determine if the defendant understood the nature of their actions, and identify any psychological conditions that might have influenced their behavior. The evaluation would be conducted by Dr. Raymond Foster, a forensic psychologist with 28 years of experience evaluating defendants ranging from serial offenders to mentally ill individuals who'd committed crimes during psychotic breaks. Dr. Foster had interviewed over 2,000 defendants in his career. He'd seen everything, or so he thought. The first session took place in a secure evaluation room at the Juvenile Detention Center where Marcus was being held. The room was deliberately neutral: beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. No windows, no decorations, nothing to distract from the conversation. Dr. Foster arrived with his standard assessment materials: a notebook, several standardized psychological tests, and a recorder to document the session. Marcus was brought in by a detention officer at exactly 9 in the morning. He was wearing standard-issue detention clothes, gray sweatpants and a gray t-shirt. His hands were cuffed in front of him until he sat down, then the cuffs were removed. He rubbed his wrists briefly, then looked at Dr. Foster with polite attention. Dr. Foster started with basic rapport-building questions. "How are you sleeping? How's the food? Are they treating you okay here?" Marcus answered each question with appropriate responses. Sleep was fine. Food was fine. Everyone was professional. His tone was conversational, almost pleasant. Dr. Foster made notes about his demeanor: calm, articulate, age-appropriate vocabulary, good eye contact, no signs of acute distress. Then he moved into the evaluation itself. He explained that they'd be talking about Marcus's life, his feelings, his understanding of why he was here. Marcus nodded, said he understood, asked if this would help his case. Dr. Foster explained that his job wasn't to help or hurt anyone's case, just to provide an honest assessment. Marcus seemed to accept this. Then he said something that made Dr. Foster pause. "So you're basically deciding if I'm crazy or not." It wasn't the question itself that was concerning. Lots of defendants asked variations of that. It was the way Marcus said it, with a slight smile, like he found the concept amusing. Dr. Foster asked him what he thought. Did Marcus think he was crazy? Marcus leaned back in his chair, considered the question, then shook his head. said, "No, I know what's real. I know right from wrong. I'm not hearing voices or seeing things. I'm just me." The answer was textbook, almost too textbook, like he'd researched what to say. Dr. Foster made a note and continued. He asked Marcus to describe his relationship with his grandparents. Marcus's expression didn't change. "They took me in when my dad couldn't take care of me, gave me a room, fed me, made sure I went to school. They did what they were supposed to do." What they were supposed to do? Dr. Foster underlined that phrase twice. He asked if Marcus felt grateful for that. Another pause. Then, what were they going to do? Let me go into foster care? They were family. They had to. Dr. Foster noted the lack of emotional connection in the response, the transactional framing. He pushed further. "Did you like living with them?" Marcus shrugged. "It was fine. Better than some places. Worse than others. No affection. No warmth. Just a cost-benefit analysis." Dr. Foster asked if they ever did anything that upset him. Marcus's eyes flickered with something, not quite anger, but close. "They had a lot of rules. Bedtime, screen time, who I could hang out with. They acted like I was still a little kid. I'm 14. I can make my own decisions." Dr. Foster spent the next 40 minutes administering standardized psychological assessments, tests designed to measure impulse control, empathy, moral reasoning, and potential personality disorders. Marcus completed each one with focused attention, reading questions carefully, answering thoughtfully. He scored within normal ranges on most measures. Above average intelligence, no signs of psychosis, no delusional thinking, no impaired reality testing. But when Dr. Foster scored the empathy assessment, he found something deeply troubling. Marcus had scored in the second percentile, meaning 98% of people his age demonstrated more capacity for empathy than he did. The responses weren't random. They were consistent, a clear pattern of inability or unwillingness to recognize or care about others' emotional states. During the second session, 2 days later, Dr. Foster decided to address the charges directly. He asked Marcus if he understood what he was accused of. Marcus nodded. "They think I killed my grandparents. Not, I'm accused of, or they're saying I did. Just, they think I did." Dr. Foster asked how that made him feel. Marcus looked at him like the question was stupid. "How do you think it makes me feel? I'm in here. I can't go home. Everyone thinks I'm some kind of monster. It sucks." Still no mention of the actual victims. No mention of grief or loss or horror at what had happened to them. Just inconvenience. Just the impact on him. Dr. Foster tried a different approach. He asked Marcus to imagine how his grandmother must have felt in her final moments, to put himself in her place, to think about the fear, the betrayal, the pain. Marcus listened to the question, thought about it, then said with complete sincerity, "I don't know. I wasn't there." Dr. Foster felt something cold settle in his chest. "But if you were to imagine it, if you were to try to feel what she felt." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Why would I do that? What's the point? She's gone. Imagining it doesn't change anything." There was no malice in his voice, no cruelty, just honest confusion about why someone would waste mental energy on an exercise that served no practical purpose. The third session focused on Marcus's understanding of consequences. Dr. Foster explained the charges in detail. 2 counts of first-degree murder, potential adult sentencing despite his age, the possibility of life without parole. Marcus listened attentively, asked clarifying questions about sentencing guidelines, about how appeals worked, about what happened to juvenile offenders in the prison system. Every question was practical, strategic. Not once did he ask about the victims' families. Not once did he express remorse or wish he could undo what had happened. When Dr. Foster asked directly, "Do you wish your grandparents were still alive?" Marcus paused, really paused, like he was calculating the correct answer, then said, "I wish none of this had happened. I wish things were different." A perfect non-answer, ambiguous enough to sound remorseful without actually admitting anything or expressing genuine emotion. During one particularly revealing moment, Dr. Foster asked Marcus what he thought people would say about him after the trial. Marcus tilted his head, considering. "Probably that I'm evil, that I'm a psychopath, that there's something wrong with me." Dr. Foster asked if Marcus thought any of that was true. "I don't think I'm evil. Evil is like wanting to hurt people for fun. I'm not like that. I just didn't want to be controlled anymore." Dr. Foster made extensive notes on that response, the justification, the minimization, the complete absence of accountability. He asked what Marcus meant by controlled. Marcus's jaw tightened, the first real display of emotion in in 3 sessions. They made all the decisions, when I could go out, who I could see, what I could do with my own time. It was like being in prison, except everyone acted like I should be grateful for it. Dr. Foster pushed harder. So you felt trapped? Marcus nodded. Exactly, trapped. And you thought the only way out was... He didn't finish the sentence, wanted to see if Marcus would. Marcus looked at him steadily. I didn't say that. You're trying to make me say something I didn't say. The deflection was immediate and skilled. Dr. Foster noted it, then asked a different question. Marcus, do you understand that 2 people are dead, that they can't come back, that their family will never see them again? Marcus sighed, actually sighed like he was bored. Yes, I understand death is permanent. I'm not stupid, but understanding and caring were 2 different things, and Marcus clearly only did one of those. In his final evaluation session, Dr. Foster administered the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, a standardized assessment used to measure psychopathic traits. It wasn't a diagnosis he gave lightly. The term psychopath had been so sensationalized in popular culture that it had lost precision, but the clinical reality was clear. Some individuals demonstrated a consistent pattern of traits: superficial charm, grandiosity, pathological lying, lack of remorse, shallow emotions, lack of empathy, failure to accept responsibility, and a parasitic lifestyle. Marcus scored high, not the highest Dr. Foster had ever seen. That distinction belonged to a 47-year-old serial offender with 17 victims, but for a 14-year-old, the score was alarming, particularly because these traits were already so well established. Dr. Foster wrote his report over the course of 3 days. He'd written hundreds of these reports. They typically followed a standard format: background, assessment methods, findings, conclusions, recommendations. But this report felt different, heavier, because what he was documenting was a teenager who demonstrated profound emotional detachment, narcissistic traits, and a complete inability to process remorse or guilt. Marcus understood right from wrong on an intellectual level. He could pass every competency test. He knew that killing was illegal. He knew society considered it wrong. But that knowledge didn't translate into feeling. It didn't create internal barriers or moral hesitation. It was just information, data to be processed and worked around. The report's conclusion was unambiguous. Marcus Chen is competent to stand trial. He understands the nature of the charges against him and is capable of assisting in his own defense. However, psychological assessment reveals significant deficits in emotional processing, empathy, and moral reasoning. The defendant demonstrates a pattern of thinking consistent with narcissistic and antisocial traits. Most concerning is his complete lack of remorse regarding the alleged offenses and his inability to emotionally connect with the impact of his actions on others. While chronologically 14 years old, the defendant's psychological profile more closely resembles that of an adult offender with established antisocial personality traits. Rehabilitation potential is guarded at best. Dr. Foster added one final note that he'd never included in a report before. In 28 years of forensic psychology, I have evaluated numerous juvenile offenders. Many were impulsive, traumatized, or acting under emotional duress. Marcus Chen is none of those things. He is the most psychologically detached minor I have ever assessed. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just what he allegedly did, but how completely unaffected he remains by it. I have never seen a 14-year-old smile when discussing victims. I have never had a minor correct my grammar during a discussion about murder. I have never encountered a child who treats his own trial as an intellectual exercise rather than a moral reckoning. If the allegations are true, society is not dealing with a child who made a terrible mistake. We are dealing with a child who made a calculated decision and feels no meaningful regret about it. The report was submitted to the court on March 15th. Copies went to the prosecution, the defense, and the judge. When Jessica Brennan read it in her office, she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. When Rebecca Santos, the defense attorney, read it, she called a meeting with Marcus to explain what it meant for his case. Marcus listened to her explain how damaging the evaluation was, how it would be used against him, how it painted him as cold and remorseless. When she finished, Marcus asked one question: "Can we get a second opinion?" Always strategic, always calculating, never emotional. And that, more than any test or assessment, told the complete story. The trial began on April 22nd, exactly 9 weeks after the murders. The courthouse was surrounded by news vans and protesters by 7 in the morning, even though proceedings wouldn't start until 9. Some protesters carried signs demanding justice for James and Linda Chen. Others carried signs arguing that a 14-year-old child shouldn't be tried as an adult regardless of the crime. The media had turned the case case into a national debate about juvenile justice, accountability, and whether someone so young could truly be irredeemable. But inside courtroom 6, none of that mattered. Inside, there was only evidence, testimony, and the question of guilt or innocence. Marcus entered the courtroom at 8:55 through a side entrance, flanked by 2 bailiffs and his attorney, Rebecca Santos. He'd been given civilian clothes for the trial: khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and a navy sweater that made him look even younger than his 14 years. It was a strategic choice by the defense. Make him look like a child, remind the jury constantly that they were judging someone who hadn't even finished middle school. Marcus walked with his head up, his expression neutral, scanning the room with what could only be described as curiosity. He looked at the jury box, still empty, looked at the gallery, packed to capacity, looked at the prosecution table where Jessica Brennan sat reviewing notes. Then he looked at the judge's bench and smiled, just slightly, just enough to be noticed. The gallery was filled with people who had personal stakes in this trial. In the front row on the prosecution side sat Helen Park, Marcus's aunt, flanked by her husband and 2 adult children. Helen had aged 10 years in the past 2 months. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. Her face was drawn and pale. She clutched a photo of her sister Linda, a candid shot from a family barbecue 3 summers ago where Linda was laughing at something off camera. Helen kept that photo in her lap throughout every day of the trial, a reminder of who they'd lost, a reminder that behind all the legal arguments and procedural motions, 2 real people had been erased from existence. Behind the family sat friends and neighbors: Patricia Gonzalez, who'd made the original 911 call; the couple from 2 houses down who'd watched the crime scene tape go up; James's former co-workers from the electrical union; Linda's book club members; people who'd known the Chens as good, quiet, unremarkable people who'd done nothing to deserve what happened to them. They all watched Marcus with expressions ranging from disgust to disbelief. How could someone so small have done something so terrible? How could someone who looked like he should be worrying about algebra homework be sitting at a defense table facing murder charges? The cognitive dissonance was visible on every face. On the defense side of the gallery sat a smaller group, a few teachers from Marcus's school who'd been subpoenaed as character witnesses, a social worker who'd worked with the family during the custody transition, and in the very back, almost hidden, sat Marcus's father, David Chen. He'd been sober for 36 days, the longest stretch in 5 years. He'd flown in from a rehabilitation facility in Arizona where he'd checked himself in the day after his son's arrest. He looked broken, hollowed out, like someone had scooped out everything inside him and left just the shell. He didn't look at Marcus, couldn't look at Marcus, because looking at his son meant confronting the reality that his failures had led to this, that his addiction had set in motion a chain of events that ended with his parents dead and his child facing life in prison. At 9 o'clock exactly, the bailiff called everyone to stand. Judge Patricia Hawthorne entered from her chambers and took her seat at the bench. She was wearing her standard black robe, her gray hair pulled back, her expression stern and focused. She surveyed the courtroom with the practiced eye of someone who'd presided over hundreds of trials. Then her gaze landed on Marcus. Their eyes met, and for just a moment something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement. She'd read Dr. Foster's report. She'd reviewed every piece of evidence. She knew exactly who was sitting at that defense table, and Marcus seemed to understand that she understood. He looked away first. The jury was brought in. 12 citizens who'd been selected after 3 days of voir dire. 7 women, 5 men, ages ranging from 26 to 68. A teacher, a retired accountant, an engineer, a nurse, a small business owner, and 7 others from various backgrounds. They'd all sworn they could be impartial, that they could judge the evidence without bias, that they understood the defendant was presumed innocent until proven guilty. But as they filed into the jury box and saw Marcus for the first time in person, several of them struggled to hide their reactions. One woman, a mother of 3, visibly stiffened when she made eye contact with him. A man in the back row, a military veteran, frowned deeply. The juror in seat 4, a young woman with dark curly hair who worked as a graphic designer, looked at Marcus and then quickly looked away, her hand moving to cover her mouth. Judge Hawthorne addressed the courtroom. Her voice was clear and authoritative. She laid out the ground rules. No outbursts, no demonstrations, no recording devices. Anyone who disrupted proceedings would be removed and potentially held in contempt. She explained that this was a court of law, not a court of public opinion, and that everyone present was expected to respect the process regardless of their personal feelings. Then she turned to the prosecution. Ms. Brennan, you may proceed with your opening statement. Jessica Brennan stood, buttoned her suit jacket, and walked to the podium positioned between the jury box and the judge's bench. She placed placed a single note card in front of her, though she barely glanced at it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and controlled, "over the next several days, you're going to hear evidence about a crime that is as calculated as it is heartbreaking. You're going to see forensic proof, witness testimony, and physical evidence that will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that Marcus Chen murdered his grandparents in cold blood while they slept. This isn't a case of self-defense. This isn't a case of accident or confusion. This is a case of premeditated murder committed by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway." She let that sink in, let the jury absorb the weight of it. Then she continued, "James and Linda Chen were 72 and 68 years old. They'd raised their son. They'd worked their entire lives. They'd retired and were enjoying the quiet peace they'd earned. And when their grandson needed them, they didn't hesitate. They opened their home. They gave him stability, safety, and love. And in return, Marcus Chen took a gun from their bedroom safe, a safe only he had access to, and he ended their lives. Not in a moment of rage, not in a moment of fear, but at 3 in the morning while they slept. He stood at the foot of their bed and he fired. Multiple times. With accuracy. With purpose. And then he sat in a chair in the corner of their bedroom and he watched. He didn't call 911. He didn't try to help. He just sat there." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Hawthorne raised one hand slightly and silence returned. Brennan continued, "The evidence will show that Marcus Chen's fingerprints are on the murder weapon, that gunshot residue was found on his hands and clothing, that his phone contained searches about minimum sentencing for juvenile offenders conducted weeks before the murders. That surveillance footage shows him leaving the house at the exact time the medical examiner determined the victims died, and that when police found him hours later, he showed no concern for his grandparents, no fear, no grief, no emotion at all, because he'd planned this, he'd thought about it, and he'd decided that 2 innocent people didn't deserve to live because they had rules he didn't want to follow." She paused, made eye contact with each juror. "You're going to hear the defense argue that Marcus is just a child, that he's too young to fully understand the consequences of his actions, that he deserves mercy because of his age. And I want you to remember something when you hear those arguments. The victims were grandparents, 72 and 68 years old. They were vulnerable. They were trusting. They were asleep in their own bed in their own home. And the person who killed them knew them, lived with them, ate meals with them, was given every advantage and opportunity. Age doesn't erase that. Age doesn't make premeditated murder acceptable. And at the end of this trial, I will ask you to find Marcus Chen guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, because that's what the evidence demands. That's what justice requires. Thank you." She returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone crying softly in the gallery. Rebecca Santos stood next. She was a 15-year veteran of the Public Defender's Office, someone who'd represented dozens of juvenile clients in difficult cases, but she'd never had a client quite like Marcus, never had a case where the evidence was so overwhelming and the defendant was so uncooperative in creating sympathy. She walked to the podium knowing this was almost certainly a losing battle, but she had a job to do, and she was going to do it. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone softer than Brennan's, "you just heard the prosecution tell you what they believe happened, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you that what happened to James and Linda Chen wasn't a tragedy. It was. It absolutely was. But what I am going to ask you to consider is context. Marcus Chen is 14 years old, not 16, not 17, 14. He's a child whose brain isn't fully developed, a child who's experienced trauma and instability his entire life, a child who was removed from his parents' care and placed with grandparents he barely knew." She paused. "None of that excuses what happened, but it matters. It matters when we're talking about intent, about premeditation, about whether a 14-year-old can truly form the same level of criminal intent as an adult." She continued for another 8 minutes, talked about adolescent brain development, about impulse control issues, about the difference between knowing something is wrong and truly understanding the permanence of death. But even as she spoke, she could see the jury wasn't buying it. They'd already seen Marcus. They'd already watched him enter the courtroom with that slight smile. They'd already read his body language, and nothing she was saying could override that visceral response. When she finished and sat down, Marcus leaned over and whispered something to her. She shook her head slightly. Whatever he'd said, it wasn't helpful. Judge Hawthorne called for a 15-minute recess before witness testimony would begin. The jury filed out. The gallery remained seated, people unwilling to give up their spots. Marcus was escorted out through the side door. And in that brief window of stillness, Helen Park looked across the aisle at David Chen. Their eyes met. She wanted to say something, wanted to scream at him that this was his fault, that his addiction and his failures had created this monster. But she couldn't, because part of her knew that monsters weren't created by one person's mistakes. They were created by something deeper, something that no amount of stability or love or second chances could fix. And that truth was somehow even more terrifying than the alternative. Because if Marcus was born this way, if something in him had always been broken, then there was never any chance to save him or his grandparents. The room had chosen its verdict before the first witness ever took the stand. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: physical evidence, digital evidence, and timeline reconstruction. Jessica Brennan knew that emotional appeals would matter, but in a case this serious, with a defendant this young, she needed the jury to see facts. Cold, undeniable, documented facts that couldn't be argued away or explained as misunderstandings. She needed to eliminate reasonable doubt, not through passion, but through precision, and that's exactly what she intended to do. The first witness called to the stand was Detective Sarah Kovach. She'd been the lead investigator from the moment she arrived at the crime scene. She documented everything, and now she was going to walk the jury through exactly what that documentation revealed. Detective Kovach was sworn in and took her seat in the witness box. She was wearing a gray suit, her dark hair pulled back, her posture professional and composed. Brennan approached with a tablet in hand, ready to display evidence on the courtroom monitors. "Detective Kovach, can you tell the jury when you first became involved in this case?" Kovach's voice was steady. "I received a call at 7:28 on the morning of February 19th. I was informed that 2 deceased individuals had been discovered at 847 Maple Ridge Drive and that initial assessment suggested homicide. I arrived on scene at 7:41. Brennan nodded. "And what did you observe when you arrived?" Kovach described the scene in clinical detail: the undisturbed exterior, the unlocked back door, the position of the victims, the chair in the corner. When she mentioned the chair, several jurors sat up straighter. Brennan had the crime scene photos displayed on the monitors. Not the graphic images of the victims, those would come later if necessary, but photos of the bedroom layout, the chair, the compression marks on the carpet. "Detective, in your professional opinion, what did the presence of that chair indicate?" Kovach didn't hesitate. It indicated that someone had moved it there deliberately and had sat in it for an extended period of time. The compression marks suggested weight distribution consistent with prolonged sitting. Based on the angle, whoever sat there would have had a direct view of the bed. The implication hung in the air. Someone had watched, had stayed, had observed their work. Brennan moved to the next topic. "Detective, you also supervised the collection of physical evidence from the scene. Can you describe what was recovered?" Kovach pulled out her notes, though she barely needed them. "We recovered the murder weapon from the garage, hidden behind Christmas decorations. We recovered spent shell casings from the bedroom. We collected fingerprint evidence from multiple surfaces, and we obtained gunshot residue samples from the defendant when he was brought in for questioning." Brennan pulled up images of each piece of evidence: the gun, the casings, the swab kits. "And what did forensic analysis of these items reveal?" Kovach looked directly at the jury. "The weapon was registered to James Chen. Ballistics confirmed it as the murder weapon. Fingerprints on the gun matched Marcus Chen, and GSR testing on Marcus's hands and clothing came back positive for all 3 residue markers." Rebecca Santos objected. "Your Honor, the witness is testifying to conclusions reached by forensic specialists, not her own direct observations." Judge Hawthorne sustained the objection. "The jury will disregard the witness's characterization of test results. Ms. Brennan, if you wish to introduce forensic findings, call the appropriate experts." Brennan nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." "Detective Kovach, let me rephrase. Did you personally observe Marcus Chen being tested for gunshot residue?" Kovach confirmed she had. "And was that testing conducted according to standard protocol?" Confirmed again. "Thank you. No further questions at this time." Santos declined to cross-examine at this stage, saving her questioning for later. Smart strategy. Don't give the detective multiple opportunities to reinforce damaging testimony. The next witness was Dr. Angela Ross, the forensic technician who'd administered the GSR test. She explained the science in terms the jury could understand: what gunshot residue was, how it transfers to a shooter's hands, how quickly it can be washed off. "In your analysis of the samples taken from Marcus Chen, what did you find?" Dr. Ross pulled up images of the test results on the monitor. "I found barium, antimony, and lead particles on both of the defendant's palms, on on the webbing between his thumb and index finger on both hands, and on the inner surfaces of both sleeves of his hoodie. The concentration and distribution pattern were consistent with someone who had recently discharged a firearm. Multiple times. Brennan let that settle. Multiple times. How could you determine that? Dr. Ross explained the particle density, the distribution, the coverage area. A single shot might leave traces on the dominant hand. What I observed suggested at least 4 to 6 discharges. Santos cross-examined this time. Dr. Ross, is it possible for gunshot residue to transfer from one person to another through contact? Dr. Ross acknowledged it was theoretically possible but unlikely. The distribution I observed was consistent with primary transfer, direct contact with a discharging weapon. Secondary transfer typically shows much lower concentrations and different distribution patterns, Santos pressed. But you can't rule it out completely? Dr. Ross admitted she couldn't rule out anything with absolute certainty, but her professional opinion was that the evidence indicated primary transfer. Santos made a note and sat down. She'd planted a seed of doubt, however small. That was her job. The digital forensics expert was next, a young man named Kevin Park, who specialized in recovering deleted data from phones and computers. He'd been given Marcus's phone on the day of the arrest and had spent 2 weeks extracting every piece of recoverable information. Mr. Park, what did your analysis of the defendant's phone reveal? Park pulled up a timeline on the monitors. Search history entries highlighted in red. I recovered multiple deleted search queries from the 6 weeks preceding the murders. The searches included phrases like, how long does gunshot residue last? Can police trace bullets? Juvenile sentencing for murder, and what happens to minors who kill family members? The timeline showed the progression, the dates, the increasing specificity of the searches. One search in particular made several jurors visibly react. It had been conducted on February 16th, 3 days before the murders. Just 4 words. Do people suffer quickly? Park explained that the query had been deleted within minutes of being searched, but deletion doesn't erase data from a device's memory, only makes it harder to access. In your professional opinion, Mr. Park, what does this search history indicate? Santos objected before he could answer. Calls for speculation, Your Honor. Sustained, Brennan rephrased. Let me ask differently. In cases where you've recovered search histories, have you seen patterns like this before? Park nodded. Yes, typically in cases where planning was involved, where the individual was researching potential consequences before taking action. Santos's cross-examination focused on alternative explanations. Mr. Park, is it possible these searches were academic, perhaps for a school project or creative writing assignment? Park admitted it was possible, but noted there was no other evidence of such a project on the device. No documents, no emails to teachers, no correspondence with classmates, just the searches. Couldn't a curious teenager search these things without intending to act on them? Park agreed that was possible. But the proximity to the actual event, searches stopping the day before the murders, that pattern is noteworthy. Santos had him restate that he was a forensic technician, not a psychologist, and couldn't determine intent from data alone. Point made, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the searches, had seen the dates, had drawn their own conclusions. The surveillance footage was introduced next through the testimony of the neighbor who owned the camera system, a man named Robert Chen, no relation to the victims despite the shared surname. He explained his system, the camera angles, the recording quality. Then Brennan played the footage on the courtroom monitors. Timestamp 3:12 a.m. A figure emerging from the Chen house. Small frame, hooded, moving purposefully. The image was grainy, shot in night vision green, but the shape was unmistakable. Mr. Chen, in your 2 years of living on that street, had you ever seen anyone leave that house at that hour? Robert shook his head. Never. James was an early riser, but never that early. The house was always dark until 6 in the morning. Brennan played the footage 3 times. Let the jury absorb it. Let them watch that figure walk away from a house where 2 people lay dead. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Lynn, testified next. She'd performed the autopsies and established the timeline of death. Her testimony was clinical, factual, devastating. Time of death between 2:45 and 3:15 in the morning. Cause of death for both victims was gunshot wounds to the head and torso. Dr. Lynn, based on the position of the bodies and the nature of the wounds, what conclusions did you reach about the circumstances of death? She explained that both victims appeared to have been asleep when shot. No defensive wounds, no signs they'd woken or struggled. The wounds were placed with accuracy, not random, not panicked, deliberate shots to vital areas. Brennan asked her to clarify. In your experience, experience, what does that level of accuracy suggest? Dr. Lin chose her words carefully. It suggests the shooter was calm, focused, not acting in the heat of passion or during a struggle. Santos objected to speculation, but the objection was overruled. Dr. Lin's experience qualified her to make such observations. The medical examiner continued, "I've examined hundreds of gunshot victims. The wound patterns tell a story. In cases of self-defense or panic, you typically see scattered shots, close range but chaotic. Here the shots were grouped, purposeful. That requires a steady hand and clear intent." She paused. "In 23 years, I've rarely seen that level of control in a crime of passion." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be typing more quietly. The weight of what was being described, the cold calculation of it, was suffocating. Brennan entered the victim's text messages into evidence next. Messages from Linda to her sister Helen in the weeks before the murders. "He's been so distant lately. I don't know how to reach him." A message from James to a friend. "Raising a teenager is harder than I remembered, especially one who's been through what Marcus has." And then messages from Marcus himself, recovered from a school friend's phone. Messages sent 2 weeks before the murders. "They act like they own me, like I'm some project they're fixing. I'm not broken. I just want to be left alone." Another message. "2 more years and I'm out. Just have to survive until then." The friend had responded asking if everything was okay. Marcus's reply, "Define okay." Each piece of evidence built on the last. The forensics, the timeline, the digital footprint, the surveillance, the autopsy results, the messages. Together, they painted a picture of premeditation so clear that even Santos seemed resigned during her cross-examinations. She did her job, poked holes where she could, raised questions about certainty and alternative explanations. But nothing she said could erase what the jury was seeing. Nothing could explain away the totality of the evidence. By the time the prosecution rested after 3 days of testimony, the case against Marcus Chen was overwhelming, mathematical, irrefutable. The only question left was whether the jury could bring themselves to convict a 14-year-old of first-degree murder, whether they could look at that small frame in the too big sweater and see not a child, but a killer. During the entire presentation of evidence, Marcus sat at the defense table with the same neutral expression he'd worn since day one. He took notes occasionally, whispered to his attorney, but he never showed distress, never shed a tear, never looked at his Aunt Helen when she broke down crying during the autopsy testimony. And the jury noticed. Every single one of them noticed, because facts mattered, evidence mattered, but so did demeanor. So did the absence of human emotion in the face of overwhelming proof that you'd destroyed your own family. And that absence was its own kind of evidence, the kind that couldn't be objected to or explained away, the kind that made 12 strangers believe that sometimes evil really does come in small packages, and sometimes age is just a number that means nothing at all. The defense's case began on the 4th day of trial. Rebecca Santos knew she was fighting an uphill battle with hurricane-force winds pushing against her. The evidence was damning. Her client was uncooperative, and worst of all, Marcus's complete lack of emotional response was doing more damage than any testimony ever could. But she had a strategy. If she couldn't prove innocence, she could at least argue for context, for understanding, for mercy based on age and development. She would call experts on adolescent brain development, school counselors who'd describe Marcus as quiet but harmless, former teachers who'd say he was a decent student. She'd paint a picture of a traumatized child who'd made an irreversible mistake. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Her first witness was Dr. Michael Torres, a developmental psychologist who specialized in adolescent cognition. He'd never met Marcus but had reviewed his case file and was prepared to testify about teenage brain development in general terms. Santos walked him through the science, the prefrontal cortex, impulse control, risk assessment, decision-making capacity. Dr. Torres explained that the adolescent brain was still developing, particularly in areas responsible for weighing consequences and controlling impulses. A 14-year-old's brain is fundamentally different from an adult's brain. They process information differently. They assess risk differently. Their capacity for long-term thinking is limited. Santos nodded along, guiding him through testimony designed to humanize Marcus, to explain him, to make the jury see him as someone whose biology had failed him. But then came the cross-examination. Jessica Brennan stood, holding Dr. Foster's psychological evaluation evaluation. Dr. Torres, you've testified about typical adolescent brain development. Are you familiar with the concept of psychopathy in minors? Dr. Torres shifted uncomfortably. I am, but that's not my area of specialization. Brennan smiled politely. But you're aware that some adolescents demonstrate traits inconsistent with typical development? Traits like profound lack of empathy, inability to form emotional bonds, and complete absence of remorse? Dr. Torres admitted he was aware. And these traits aren't caused by underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, are they? They're caused by something else, something structural, something that doesn't improve with age. Dr. Torres had to agree. That's correct. But without examining the defendant myself, Brennan cut him off. You haven't examined the defendant, but Dr. Raymond Foster has, and his evaluation will be entered into evidence. Thank you, Dr. Torres. No further questions. Santos called a school counselor next, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Wells, who'd worked with Marcus during his transition to living with his grandparents. She testified that Marcus had been cooperative during their sessions, quiet but engaged. He'd talked about missing his father, about feeling out of place, about struggling to adjust. Did Marcus ever exhibit violent tendencies during your interactions with him? Santos asked. Mrs. Wells shook her head. Never. He was always polite, reserved, but polite. Santos tried to build on this. In your professional opinion, did Marcus present as someone capable of violence? Mrs. Wells hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. I wouldn't have thought so, but I also only saw him for 45 minutes once a week. There's only so much you can know. Brennan's cross-examination was brief but effective. Mrs. Wells, how many sessions did you have with Marcus? 6 sessions total. And did he ever discuss his grandparents during those sessions? Rarely. Did he ever express gratitude for what they were doing for him? Mrs. Wells had to think about that. Not explicitly, no, but teenagers often struggle to express gratitude. Brennan nodded. Did he ever express any emotion at all during your sessions? Sadness, anger, fear, anything? Mrs. Wells paused. He was very controlled, very measured in what he shared. Brennan let that answer hang. Controlled and measured. Thank you, Mrs. Wells. The implication was clear. Even the counselor had noticed something was off. Even she had seen the emotional flatness. The defense called 2 former teachers who described Marcus as an adequate student. Not exceptional, but competent. One teacher mentioned he'd been helpful when another student was struggling with math. He explained concepts in a way that made sense. He was patient. Santos tried to build on this. So he was capable of helping others? Of showing consideration? The teacher agreed. But on cross-examination, Brennan pointed out that helping someone with homework wasn't the same as empathy. Being good at explaining math doesn't mean you care about the person learning it. It just means you understand math. The teacher had no response to that. Another small victory for the prosecution. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Rebecca Santos called Marcus Chen to the stand. It was a massive risk, probably a terrible decision. But she'd advised him of the dangers, and he'd insisted. I want to tell my side, he'd said. Santos knew it would likely backfire, but she also knew that if she didn't let him testify, the jury would wonder what he was hiding. Better to control the narrative as best she could and hope that somehow Marcus would find it in himself to show something human, something vulnerable, something that would make 12 people see him as a child instead of a monster. It was a desperate hope, but hope was all she had left. Marcus walked to the witness stand with the same calm demeanor he'd shown throughout the trial. He was sworn in, placed his hand on the Bible, promised to tell the truth. Then he sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked at his attorney, waiting for the first question. Santos started gentle. Marcus, can you tell the jury about your life before you went to live with your grandparents? He described his childhood in factual terms. Parents who struggled, moving frequently, not having much stability. When your grandparents took you in, how did that make you feel? Marcus paused. Grateful, I guess. It was better than foster care. That, I guess, killed any emotional impact. Santos tried again. Can you describe your relationship with James and Linda? Marcus shrugged slightly. They were nice. They gave me food and a place to sleep. Made sure I went to school. Santos could feel the jury reacting negatively. She needed to pivot. Marcus, do you understand why you're here? Do you understand what you're accused of? He nodded. They think I killed my grandparents. Santos winced at the phrasing. And did you? The courtroom went completely silent. Every person held their breath. Marcus looked directly at the jury and said, yes. One word, no emotion, no No explanation, just confirmation. Santos's heart sank. She'd prepared him for this, told him that if he admitted guilt, he needed to show remorse, needed to explain, needed to make them understand. But he'd just confirmed the worst possible thing in the worst possible way. She tried damage control. Marcus, can you tell the jury why? Can you help them understand what led to that night? Marcus thought about it, really thought about it, then said, they wouldn't leave me alone. They had all these rules. I couldn't do what I wanted. I felt trapped. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel. Order! I will have order in this court. The whispers subsided, but the damage was done. Santos asked him to elaborate, to explain the feeling of being trapped, to talk about his trauma, his difficult childhood, anything that would contextualize what he'd just admitted. But Marcus's answers remained flat, transactional, focused on his own feelings of inconvenience rather than any recognition of what he'd done. Then came Brennan's cross-examination. She approached slowly, deliberately. Marcus, you just told this jury that you killed your grandparents because they had rules you didn't like. Is that accurate? He nodded. Yes. Brennan let that answer breathe. What kind of rules? Marcus listed them. Bedtime, screen time limits, having to tell them where he was going. Standard rules that most teenagers live with, Brennan suggested. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'm not most teenagers. Brennan pounced on that. No, you're not, are you? Most teenagers don't murder their grandparents when they have a curfew. Santos objected. Argumentative, sustained, but the point was made. Brennan continued. Marcus, on the night of February 18th, your grandparents went to bed believing they were safe in their own home. They'd fed you dinner. They'd said goodnight. They trusted you. Do you understand that? Marcus nodded. Yes. His tone suggested he was bored, that this was taking too long. Brennan's voice hardened. And you waited until they were asleep. You took a gun from their safe. You walked into their bedroom, and you shot them, multiple times, while they slept. Is that accurate? Marcus confirmed it was. Did they wake up? Brennan asked. Not really. Maybe for a second, but not long. The casualness of his response made someone in the gallery gasp. Judge Hawthorne looked like she wanted to intervene but legally couldn't. This was testimony. This was what the defense had chosen. Marcus, after you shot them, what did you do? Brennan already knew the answer but wanted the jury to hear it from him. I sat down. A pause. You sat down. Brennan repeated. Where? Marcus gestured vaguely. There was a chair in the corner. I moved it so I could see better. The courtroom was deathly silent. See better? Brennan echoed. See what, Marcus? He looked confused by the question. See them. See what happened. I wanted to make sure it worked. Several jurors looked physically ill. One woman put her hand over her mouth. A man in the back row closed his eyes. This wasn't testimony. This was a confession without remorse. This was a window into something profoundly broken. Brennan pressed harder. Do you feel bad about what you did? Marcus considered the question. I feel bad that I'm here, that everyone is upset, that I got caught. Brennan repeated his words slowly. You feel bad that you got caught. Not that 2 people are dead, not that your family is destroyed, that you got caught. Marcus seemed to realize he'd said something wrong. He tried to correct. I mean, I wish it hadn't happened. I wish things were different. But the damage was absolute. Terminal. Santos tried to redirect on follow-up, tried to get him to show emotion, to cry, to demonstrate some human feeling, but Marcus couldn't, or wouldn't. He answered her questions with the same flat effect he'd shown throughout. When he finally stepped down from the stand and returned to the defense table, Rebecca Santos looked defeated. She'd known it would be bad, but she hadn't known it would be that bad. Judge Hawthorne called for a recess. As the jury filed out, several of them looked at Marcus with open disgust. When the courtroom cleared, Judge Hawthorne did something unusual. She addressed Marcus directly from the bench. Mr. Chen, I need you to understand something. This court has been patient with you. We've followed proper procedure. We've ensured you had adequate representation. But I want you to look around this room. Marcus looked up at her confused. Your aunt is crying. Your father can't even look at you. The jury is horrified. And you are sitting there like this is all some inconvenience, some game you're forced to play. Her voice was controlled but intense. I have presided over this court for 6 years. I have seen terrible things, but I have never seen someone your age display such complete absence of human feeling. And I want you to know that regardless of what the jury decides, this court sees you. This court understands exactly what you are. Rebecca Santos started to object, but Judge Hawthorne raised a hand. "Counselor, your client just admitted to premeditated murder on the stand without showing an ounce of remorse. I am well within my rights to address courtroom conduct and demeanor. Mr. Chen, whatever happens next, you need to understand that there are consequences for actions, and there are consequences for how you present yourself. You've spent this entire trial acting as though you're above this process, as though the pain you've caused doesn't matter. I'm here to tell you, it matters, and it will continue to matter for the rest of your life." She looked at the bailiffs. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes for closing arguments." Then she stood and left the bench, her robe swirling behind her. The courtroom remained frozen. No one had ever seen Judge Hawthorne lose her composure like that, but it wasn't lost composure. It was controlled fury. It was a judge who'd seen enough and decided that silence wasn't justice. It was the beginning of something unprecedented. The courtroom reconvened at 2:30 in the afternoon. The tension was palpable. Judge Hawthorne's unexpected rebuke of Marcus had shifted something in the atmosphere. What had been a trial focused on evidence and procedure had become something more personal, more human. The jury filed back in looking somber and determined. They'd had 30 minutes to process what they'd just witnessed, 30 minutes to absorb Marcus's testimony and the judge's response. And when they looked at the defense table now, their expressions had hardened. Whatever small sympathy might have existed for a 14-year-old defendant had evaporated. They'd heard him speak. They'd heard him admit to murder with less emotion than someone describing a trip to the grocery store, and they'd made up their minds. Rebecca Santos stood to deliver her closing argument knowing it was futile, but she was a professional. She had an ethical obligation to provide the best defense possible regardless of how her client had sabotaged himself. She approached the jury box with notes she'd rewritten 3 times during the recess. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard difficult testimony over these past 4 days. You've seen evidence that is disturbing. You've heard my client admit to actions that resulted in 2 deaths. I'm not standing here to tell you that what happened wasn't terrible. It was. 2 people lost their lives. A family was destroyed. That's not in dispute." She paused, making eye contact with each juror. "But what I am asking you to consider is the question of intent, of capacity, of whether a 14-year-old child can truly form the same level of premeditation and malice that the law requires for first-degree murder." She continued building her argument around adolescent development, around trauma, around the instability Marcus had experienced throughout his childhood. This is a boy who was removed from his parents at age 12, who bounced between homes, who never had consistent care or guidance until his grandparents took him in. And even then, he was expected to adapt to an entirely new environment with rules and structure he'd never experienced before. She acknowledged his testimony had been problematic. "You heard Marcus on the stand. You heard him struggle to articulate his emotions, to explain himself. And I know that was difficult to watch, but that emotional flatness, that inability to express himself appropriately, those are symptoms of trauma, of a child who learned early in life that emotions were dangerous. That showing vulnerability led to pain." Santos was grasping at straws and she knew it, but she pressed on. "The prosecution wants you to see Marcus as a cold-blooded killer, as someone who planned and executed a murder with adult-level calculation. But what I'm asking you to see is a damaged child who made an irreversible mistake, a child whose brain literally hasn't finished developing, a child who, in a moment of feeling trapped and desperate, did something he can never take back." She talked about the possibility of rehabilitation, about how young people could change, about how the juvenile justice system existed precisely because society recognized that children weren't just small adults. "If you convict Marcus of first-degree murder, you're saying that a 14-year-old is beyond redemption, that there's no hope, no possibility of change. And I'm asking you to leave that door open, to consider a lesser charge that acknowledges what happened while also acknowledging Marcus's age and capacity." She concluded with a plea for mercy. "This case will follow you. The images you've seen, the testimony you've heard, they'll stay with you. But I'm asking you to make a decision based not on emotion, but on the legal standard. Does the evidence prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Marcus Chen, at 14 years old, committed premeditated first-degree murder with full understanding and malicious intent? Or is there reasonable doubt that someone his age, with his background, could truly form that level of criminal intent? That's the question before you. Thank you." She returned to her seat, knowing she'd done her job, knowing it wouldn't matter, knowing that Marcus's own testimony had sealed his fate far more effectively than any evidence could have. Jessica Brennan stood for the prosecution's closing argument. She didn't need notes. She'd been preparing this moment in her mind since the day she'd reviewed the case file. She walked to the center of the courtroom and stood there for a moment in silence. Let the weight of everything that had happened settle over the room. Then she spoke. "Defense counsel just asked you to consider Marcus Chen's age, his trauma, trauma, his difficult childhood. And she's right about one thing. This case will follow you, but not for the reasons she thinks. This case will follow you because you've had to sit in this courtroom and watch a 14-year-old boy describe murdering his grandparents with less emotion than you'd show discussing a math problem. Brennan's voice was controlled but forceful. Let's talk about age. Yes, Marcus is 14, but he knew how to access a locked safe. He knew how to load and fire a weapon. He knew how to delete search history on his phone, though not well enough to hide it from forensics. He knew to leave the house after the murders. He knew to act normal when police found him. He knew to say, "I was asleep," when questioned. That's not a child acting on impulse. That's a person executing a plan. She let that sink in. The defense wants you to believe this was a moment of desperation, a snap decision by a traumatized child. But the evidence tells a different story. The evidence tells us about weeks of searches, about planning, about patience, about waiting for the right moment when his grandparents would be most vulnerable, asleep in their own bed. She walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each person. Defense counsel mentioned trauma. Let's talk about trauma. James and Linda Chen experienced trauma too. They lost their son to addiction. They watched him destroy his life over and over again. And when they were finally in a place to enjoy retirement, to rest after decades of hard work, they stepped up. They took in their grandson. They gave him stability. They gave him safety. They gave him love. And that trauma, that sacrifice, ended with them being shot to death in their own home by the child they were trying to save. Several jurors were visibly emotional. One woman had tears streaming down her face. Brennan continued, "You heard Marcus testify. You heard him say he killed them because they had rules, because they wouldn't leave him alone, because he felt controlled." Brennan's voice hardened. Controlled. He felt controlled because his grandparents wanted to know where he was going, because they set a bedtime, because they cared about his safety and his future. And his response to that care, to that love, was to end their lives, not in a moment of rage, not in self-defense, but methodically, while they slept, and then to sit in a chair and watch, to make sure, in his own words, it worked. She paused. "I've been a prosecutor for 14 years. I've handled hundreds of cases, and I have never heard a defendant describe their own actions with such detachment, such complete absence of remorse or human feeling. Defense counsel says that's trauma. I'm telling you that's something else entirely. That's a fundamental break in the capacity for empathy and moral reasoning that no amount of childhood difficulty can fully explain." She returned to the center of the courtroom. "You heard Dr. Foster's evaluation. You heard him describe Marcus as the most psychologically detached minor he'd ever assessed in 28 years. 28 years of evaluating troubled children, and Marcus stood out. Not because of his trauma, not because of his age, but because of his complete inability to connect with the harm he caused, with the permanent destruction of 2 human lives." Brennan pulled up an image on the courtroom monitors, a photo of James and Linda Chen from their 40th wedding anniversary. They were smiling, arms around each other, looking at the camera with genuine happiness. These are the people we're here for. Not just statistics in a police report, not just victims in a criminal case. Real people who worked hard, loved their family, and tried to do the right thing. And they were murdered in the safest place they knew, their own bedroom, by someone they trusted completely. She let the image stay on the screen. Defense counsel asked you to leave the door open for redemption, to consider rehabilitation, to think about Marcus's future. And I want you to think about futures. Think about James Chen's future. He was 72. He had friends he met for coffee every week. He had projects he was working on. He had years left to enjoy the life he'd built. Gone. Linda Chen was 68. She had a book club. She had grandchildren she wanted to watch grow up. She had a garden she'd spent years cultivating. Gone. Their futures ended at 3 in the morning on February 19th because a 14-year-old decided his curfew was more important than their lives. Brennan walked back to her table and picked up a document. "You've heard testimony about Marcus's phone searches. Let me read you one more time what he was looking up weeks before the murders. Minimum sentence for juvenile offenders. Can police trace bullets? What happens to minors who kill family members? This isn't curiosity. This isn't a school project. This is research. This is someone planning ahead. Someone who knew exactly what they intended to do and wanted to understand the consequences. Someone who calculated that even if caught, their age would protect them, that they could murder 2 people and be out by age 21. That's not trauma, that's strategy." She approached the jury box one final time. "The defense wants you to see a child, and when you look at Marcus Chen, you do see someone who physically appears young, who sits in a chair with his feet barely touching the floor, who looks like he should be worrying about about homework and sports and normal teenage concerns. But appearances don't change facts. Age doesn't erase intent, and youth doesn't excuse premeditated murder. The law recognizes that some acts are so serious, so calculated, so fundamentally contrary to our most basic moral standards that age becomes irrelevant. This is one of those cases. Not because we want to punish a child, but because the person sitting at that table planned and executed a double homicide with full knowledge of what he was doing and showed no remorse, not even a little, not even when given every opportunity. Brennan's voice grew quieter, more intense. You've heard Marcus explain himself. You've watched him testify without emotion. You've seen him smile at inappropriate moments throughout this trial, and you've had to wonder, what kind of person does that? What kind of 14-year-old sits through testimony about their grandparents' murders without crying, without showing any sign that they understand the magnitude of what they've done? Defense counsel says that's developmental, that his brain isn't finished forming, but I'm telling you that some things have nothing to do with brain development. Knowing that murder is wrong isn't learned at age 18. It's understood by age 5. Marcus knew. He knows. He just doesn't care. She picked up the case file from her table. Everything you need is in this file. The GSR results, the fingerprints, the phone records, the surveillance footage, the autopsy reports, the ballistics, the timeline. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. Marcus Chen committed 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder, not in self-defense, not in a moment of passion, but deliberately, calculatedly, with planning and intent. The evidence isn't circumstantial. It's not ambiguous. It's overwhelming, and it demands a verdict that matches the severity of what happened. 2 innocent people were executed in their sleep by someone they loved, someone they'd opened their home to, someone they were trying to save. Brennan stood directly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each person one final time. When you go into that deliberation room, you're going to have to ask yourselves a hard question. Not what you wish were true, not what would be easier to accept, but what the evidence proves. And the evidence proves that Marcus Chen is guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The defense has asked you to show mercy based on age, but I'm asking you to show justice for 2 people who showed nothing but kindness and got murder in return. For James and Linda Chen, who can't speak for themselves anymore. For their family, who will never recover from this loss. And for a society that needs to know that some acts are so wrong, so irredeemable, that age cannot be used as a shield. Thank you. She returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of crying from the gallery. Helen Park had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Her husband held her, his own face twisted with grief. David Chen sat in the back row staring at nothing, completely broken. The jury looked shaken. Several were crying openly. This wasn't a normal trial. This wasn't a case where reasonable people could disagree about what happened. This was a case where the facts were clear. The defendant had confessed, and the only question left was whether 12 people could bring themselves to convict a 14-year-old of the most serious crime possible. Judge Hawthorne addressed the jury, giving them their instructions, explaining reasonable doubt, explaining the elements of first-degree murder, explaining their duty. Then she dismissed them to deliberate. As the jury filed out, Marcus turned to Rebecca Santos and whispered something. She shook her head and whispered back. He shrugged, unconcerned. Even now, even after everything, he didn't seem to grasp the reality of his situation. Or maybe he did grasp it and simply didn't care. Either possibility was equally disturbing. The bailiffs led him back to holding. The gallery slowly emptied, and Judge Hawthorne sat alone at her bench for a long moment after everyone left, staring at the empty jury box. She'd presided over hundreds of trials. She'd seen the best and worst of humanity, but this case had gotten under her skin in a way nothing else had, because Marcus Chen was 14, because he'd admitted everything, and because even now, even after all the evidence and testimony and confrontation, he remained utterly unchanged, unmoved, unaffected, and that terrified her more than any violent outburst ever could, because violence could be understood, rage could be explained, but this cold absence of everything human, that was something different, something worse, and it was sitting in her courtroom waiting for judgment. The jury began deliberations at 4:15 in the afternoon. They were escorted to the deliberation room on the 3rd floor, a windowless space with a long table, 12 chairs, and walls painted an institutional beige that did nothing to ease the weight of what they were about to decide. A court officer explained the process. They could request evidence. They could ask questions through written notes. They could take as much time as they needed. No one was rushing them. This was about getting it right, not getting it done quickly. The officer left and closed the door. 12 strangers sat around a table and looked at each other, suddenly aware that they held someone's entire future in their hands. Even if that someone was a confessed murderer, even if that someone had shown no remorse, the responsibility was crushing. The foreperson was selected within minutes. A woman named Janet Morrison, 53 years old, a high school teacher with 2 teenage sons of her own. She'd been chosen because she'd been organized during voir dire, taking careful notes, asking thoughtful questions. The other jurors trusted her to guide them through this. Janet arranged the evidence folders in the center of the table. She had the jury instructions printed out. She looked around at her fellow jurors and said, "This is going to be hard, but we need to focus on the law, not our emotions. Let's start with a preliminary vote, just to see where we stand. No discussion yet. Just write guilty or not guilty on a piece of paper." They did. Janet collected them, counted, then looked up with an expression of grim certainty. 11 guilty, 1 not sure. The not sure vote came from Juror 7, a 26-year-old man named Daniel Park, who worked in software development. He spoke up immediately. "I'm not saying he didn't do it. The evidence is overwhelming, but I'm struggling with convicting a 14-year-old of first-degree murder. That's a life sentence. That's saying there's no hope for someone who's barely started life." Janet nodded. "I understand. Let's talk through it." For the next hour, they reviewed the evidence systematically. The GSR results, the fingerprints, the phone searches, the surveillance footage, the confession. Every piece confirmed what they all knew. Marcus had killed his grandparents. Intentionally, with planning. There was no question about that. The question was whether it met the legal standard for first-degree murder. A retired accountant named Robert Chen, no relation to the victims or defendant despite the shared surname, pulled out the jury instructions. First-degree murder requires premeditation and malice aforethought. Premeditation means the defendant thought about it beforehand, planned it. The phone searches prove that. The hiding of the weapon proves that. Waiting until they were asleep proves that. That's premeditation. He looked at Daniel. Malice aforethought means the intent to kill. He admitted that on the stand. Said he wanted to make sure it worked. That's malice. The legal standard is met. Age doesn't change the elements of the crime. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing this, but he still looked troubled. A nurse named Patricia Williams, 41, spoke up next. "I'm a mother of 3. One of my kids is 15, and I keep looking at Marcus and thinking, what if that were my child? What if something in their brain was just broken from birth? Don't we have an obligation to try to fix it instead of locking them away forever?" Several jurors nodded. This was the heart of the moral dilemma. Janet let the question sit for a moment. Then a military veteran named Thomas Wright responded, "I've been thinking about that too, but here's what I keep coming back to. The grandparents. They tried to fix him. They gave him everything. Stability, love, safety. Rules, yes, but reasonable ones, and he murdered them for it. At some point, the obligation to rehabilitate ends, and the obligation to protect society begins." The discussion continued for another 2 hours. They reviewed Marcus's testimony, his flat effect, his admission that he felt bad about getting caught, not about the deaths themselves, his complete inability to show remorse even when directly asked, the psychologist's evaluation describing him as the most emotionally detached minor ever assessed. One juror, a graphic designer named Lisa Chang, said what several others were thinking. "I wanted to feel sympathy for him. I really did. When I first saw him walk into that courtroom, I thought, this is a child. But then he testified, and I've never seen anything like that. He talked about sitting in that chair watching them die like he was describing a homework assignment. That's not developmental. That's not trauma. That's something fundamentally wrong." By 7 o'clock, they'd ordered dinner and were still deliberating. The court officer brought sandwiches and coffee. They ate while continuing to discuss. Daniel, the holdout, kept returning to the same point. But what if he changes? What if in 10 years his brain finishes developing and he becomes capable of remorse? Don't we owe him that chance? Robert, the accountant, responded patiently. The law allows for parole hearings. If he changes, if he demonstrates genuine rehabilitation, the system has mechanisms for that. But that's different from our job here. Our job is to determine if the evidence proves he committed first-degree murder, and it does. What happens after that is for others to decide. Daniel sat with that. He looked at the evidence spread across the table. He looked at the jury instructions, and slowly he nodded. They took another vote at 8:30. This time it was unanimous. All 12 guilty. But Janet wanted wanted to be sure. Let's go through it one more time. Make absolutely certain we're comfortable with this. They spent another hour reviewing everything. The timeline, the forensics, the confession, the psychology. Every element of first-degree murder was met. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. And every juror, even Daniel, agreed that the verdict was supported by the law. At 9:45, Janet knocked on the door and told the court officer they'd reached a decision. The officer nodded and left to inform the judge. The jurors sat in silence, knowing what was about to happen, knowing that in a few minutes they'd walk back into that courtroom and change a 14-year-old's life forever. While the jury deliberated, the gallery had emptied and then slowly refilled as word spread that a verdict might be coming soon. Helen Park had never left. She'd sat in the same seat for over 5 hours, occasionally stepping out to use the restroom, but always returning. Her husband brought her coffee and a sandwich she didn't touch. She just sat there, staring at the empty judge's bench, waiting. Other family members came and went. Neighbors appeared. Reporters gathered in the hallway, not allowed in the courtroom but ready to capture reactions the moment people emerged. The tension was suffocating. Everyone knew what the verdict would be. The evidence was too strong, the confession too clear, but knowing and hearing it spoken aloud were two different things. Marcus had been kept in a holding cell adjacent to the courtroom. Rebecca Santos visited him twice during the wait. She tried to prepare him for what was likely coming, tried to explain that a guilty verdict was almost certain and that he needed to show appropriate remorse during sentencing if he had any hope of mercy. Marcus listened with the same detached attention he'd shown throughout. He asked practical questions. How long before sentencing? Could he appeal? What were his chances of parole? Never once did he ask about his family. Never once did he express regret. Santos left the second meeting feeling emotionally exhausted. She'd represented difficult clients before, guilty clients, unsympathetic clients, but never someone so utterly disconnected from their own humanity. David Chen had left the courthouse after closing arguments. He couldn't bear to stay, couldn't bear to watch his son be convicted, couldn't bear to face Helen and the rest of the family who blamed him, rightfully, for setting this tragedy in motion. He'd gone back to his hotel room and sat on the bed, staring at nothing. His phone rang repeatedly. His lawyer, his sponsor from rehab, his sister. He answered none of them. He just sat there replaying 14 years of failures. Every time he'd chosen substances over his son, every promise he'd broken, every moment he'd been absent. He told himself that Marcus's actions weren't his fault, that people made their own choices, but he didn't believe it. Not really, because he'd created the circumstances that led Marcus to his grandparents. He'd created the instability and trauma that defense attorneys would point to for years, and he'd created a child he didn't know how to love properly. That guilt was heavier than any verdict a jury could deliver. At 10 o'clock, the word came down. The jury had reached a verdict. Court would reconvene in 15 minutes. The gallery filled rapidly. News of the decision spread through the courthouse like electricity. Reporters positioned themselves in the hallway. Cameras were set up on the courthouse steps. Inside courtroom 6, people filed in silently, taking their seats with an almost reverent solemnity. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. Helen clutched her photo of Linda Titer. Patricia Gonzalez, the neighbor who'd made the 911 call, held hands with the woman next to her. In the back row, a space remained empty where David Chen should have been. Marcus was brought in through the side door at 10:12. He walked between the bailiffs with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained for weeks. He sat next to Rebecca Santos, who leaned over and whispered something to him. He nodded. His expression remained neutral. Even now, facing the moment that would define the rest of his life, he showed no visible anxiety, no fear, no anticipation, just the same blank attentiveness he'd shown since day one. The bailiffs took their positions. The court reporter prepared her machine, and everyone waited. Judge Patricia Hawthorne entered at 10:15. Everyone stood. She took her seat and surveyed the courtroom. The tension was so thick it was almost visible. She looked at Marcus for a long moment, then she turned to the bailiff. "Bring in the jury." The 12 people who'd spent the last 6 hours deciding Marcus Chen's fate filed in slowly. None of them looked at the defense table. That was the tell. Defense attorneys knew that when a jury avoided eye contact with the defendant, it meant conviction. Rebecca Santos's shoulders sagged slightly. She'd known it was coming, but confirmation still hurt. Judge Hawthorne addressed the foreperson. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" Janet Morrison stood. Her voice was steady but quiet. "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff took the verdict form from her and delivered it to the judge. Judge Hawthorne read it silently. Her expression revealed nothing. Then she handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to Janet. The judge looked at Marcus. "The defendant will rise." Marcus stood. Rebecca Santos stood with him. The courtroom held its collective collective breath. Judge Hawthorne nodded to the foreperson. "Madam Foreperson, you may read the verdict." Janet Morrison looked down at the paper in her hands. Her voice was clear, despite the tremor underneath. "In the matter of the State versus Marcus James Chen, case number CR 2025-4187, on the charge of murder in the first degree of James Chen, we the jury find the defendant, Marcus James Chen." She paused, just for a second. Then, "Guilty." The courtroom erupted, not in cheers or celebration, but in a wave of emotion that had been held back for too long. Helen Park collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing. Patricia Gonzalez covered her face with her hands. Several people in the gallery wept openly. Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel. "Order, we're not finished." The room quieted. Janet continued. "On the charge of murder in the first degree of Linda Chen, we the jury find the defendant Marcus James Chen guilty." More crying, more gasps. Judge Hawthorne thanked the jury for their service, informed them that sentencing would be scheduled separately, asked if either side wanted the jury polled. The prosecution declined. The defense declined. The jury was dismissed. As they filed out, several of them were crying. Daniel Park, the initial holdout, looked at Marcus one last time. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no triumph, just sadness at what they'd been forced to do. The jury disappeared into the hallway, and then there were just the principals left. The judge, the attorneys, the defendant, and a gallery full of people trying to process what had just happened. Judge Hawthorne looked at Marcus. "Mr. Chen, you've been found guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. You will remain in custody pending sentencing. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but clear. "Yes, Your Honor." No emotion, no breakdown, no moment of realization, just acknowledgement. Rebecca Santos put a hand on his shoulder. Whether for his comfort or hers wasn't clear. Judge Hawthorne continued. "Sentencing will be held in 1 week. At that time, victim impact statements will be heard and the court will determine the appropriate sentence within the parameters allowed by law. This court stands in recess." She stood. Everyone stood. And as she exited, the courtroom finally released the tension it had been holding. People embraced. People cried. People left as quickly as they could, desperate for fresh air and distance from what they'd just witnessed. Marcus was led back to the holding cell. As the bailiffs walked him through the side door, he glanced back at the courtroom one time. His expression was unreadable, but to those watching, it looked almost like curiosity, like he was studying the scene, analyzing the reactions. Even in defeat, even in conviction, he remained detached, observing, clinical, and that, more than any verdict, was the truest measure of who Marcus Chen was. Not a child who'd made a terrible mistake, but someone fundamentally incapable of connecting with the weight of what he'd done. The gavel had fallen. Guilt had been determined. But justice? That was still 1 week away, and Judge Patricia Hawthorne had that entire week to consider what justice looked like for a 14-year-old who'd executed his grandparents and felt nothing about it. That consideration would lead to a decision that would make legal history, but for now, there was only the verdict. Guilty, twice over, and a courtroom full of people who would carry this moment with them forever. The week between verdict and sentencing felt longer than the entire trial. For the families, it was 7 days of waiting to hear what punishment could possibly match the crime. For the attorneys, it was 7 days of preparing arguments about a 14-year-old's future. For Marcus, it was 7 days in juvenile detention that he spent reading, sleeping, and showing the same emotional detachment that had defined him from the beginning. And for Judge Patricia Hawthorne, it was 7 days of research, reflection, and wrestling with a decision that would affect not just one case, but potentially reshape how the justice system handled juvenile offenders who demonstrated no capacity for rehabilitation. She barely slept. She read case law until her eyes burned, and she wrote draft after draft of the statement she would deliver from the bench. The victim's family spent the week preparing impact statements. Helen Park wrote and rewrote hers a dozen times. How do you capture the loss of a sister in a few paragraphs? How do you explain to a courtroom what it feels like to know that someone you loved died terrified and betrayed? She wrote about Linda's laugh, about how she'd always been the peacemaker in their family, about the last conversation they'd had, just 3 days before the murders, where Linda had said she was tired but hopeful. "Marcus is coming around," she'd said. "I think we're finally getting through to him." Helen had to stop writing at that point, had to put down her pen and cry until she couldn't cry anymore. because Linda had died believing she was making progress, had died thinking her love was working, and that illusion had been as deadly as the bullets. James's former co-workers prepared a joint statement. They described a man who'd mentored younger electricians, who'd never missed a day of work in 30 years, who'd bought lunch for the apprentices who couldn't afford it, who'd shown up to help with projects long after he'd retired, not for money, but because he genuinely enjoyed the work and the community. James Chen was the kind of man who made the world better just by being in it, the statement read. His death has left a hole in our union, in our neighborhood, and in all of us who knew him. We hope the court understands that what was taken wasn't just 2 lives. It was decades of potential kindness, of future help, of wisdom that would have been shared. Marcus Chen didn't just steal his grandparents' remaining years. He stole all the good they would have done for others. Rebecca Santos met with Marcus 3 times that week to prepare for sentencing. Each meeting was more frustrating than the last. She tried to coach him on what to say, on how to present himself, on the importance of showing remorse, genuine or performed, because his life literally depended on it. Judge Hawthorne has discretion in how she sentences you, Santos explained during their final meeting. She can sentence you as a juvenile with review at 21, or she can invoke special circumstances and lock you in until you're much older. Your demeanor matters. Your statement matters. You need to show her something human, something that indicates you understand the gravity of what you've done. Marcus listened, then asked, "What should I say?" Santos stared at him. "It needs to be genuine, Marcus. If you fake it, she'll know. You need to actually feel something." Marcus looked confused by that directive. "But I don't feel what you want me to feel. I feel bad that I'm here. I feel bad that everyone is upset. Isn't that enough?" Santos closed her eyes. "No, it's not. You need to feel bad that 2 people are dead, that your grandmother will never read another book, that your grandfather will never have another conversation, that their family will never see them again. You need to feel the loss of them, not just the inconvenience to you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that chilled Santos to her core. "I'm trying to understand what you want from me, but I don't think I can give it to you. I don't know how to feel things I don't feel." Santos realized then that this sentencing hearing wouldn't be about rehabilitation or hope. It would be about damage control, about preventing the worst possible outcome, because her client was, as Dr. Foster had documented, fundamentally incapable of the emotional response the system expected. Jessica Brennan spent the week consulting with victim advocacy groups and reviewing juvenile sentencing precedent. She knew Judge Hawthorne was in a difficult position. The law provided parameters for juvenile offenders, even those convicted of first-degree murder. But those parameters assumed the possibility of rehabilitation, assumed that youthful offenders, given time and intervention, could change. Marcus Chen challenged that assumption. Every expert who'd examined him said the same thing. His psychological profile suggested deeply ingrained traits unlikely to change with age or therapy. So what did justice look like in a case like this? Brennan drafted her sentencing recommendation carefully. She would ask for the maximum allowable under juvenile statutes, with specific provisions that would make parole nearly impossible unless Marcus demonstrated genuine transformation. The media coverage during that week was relentless. The case had captured national attention. Debate raged on news programs and social media about juvenile justice, about nature versus nurture, about whether someone could be irredeemable at 14. Some argued that any child could be saved with the right intervention. Others pointed to Marcus's complete lack of remorse as evidence that some people were simply born without the capacity for empathy. Legal experts weighed in on what sentence was likely. Most predicted Judge Hawthorne would follow standard juvenile guidelines, detention until age 21 with possibility of review. A few predicted something more severe. One legal analyst noted that Judge Hawthorne had a history of creative sentencing within legal boundaries. "She's going to look for a way to protect society while staying within the law," the analyst said, "and I think she'll find it." Judge Hawthorne spent hours in her chambers reviewing not just this case, but similar cases from across the country. She read about other juvenile offenders who'd killed family members. She studied their outcomes. Some had been successfully rehabilitated, had gone on to lead productive lives after release. Others had reoffended immediately. Others remained in prison decades later, still showing no remorse, still presenting a danger to society. She looked for patterns, for indicators that might predict Marcus's trajectory, and what she found was unsettling. The juveniles who'd successfully rehabilitated had shown something Marcus hadn't: genuine emotional distress at what they'd done. Even those who'd committed terrible crimes in anger or desperation had eventually broken down, had cried, had expressed regret. Marcus had shown nothing, and that absence was its its own kind of evidence. She reviewed the psychological evaluation multiple times. Dr. Foster's assessment that Marcus was the most emotionally detached minor he'd encountered in nearly 3 decades of work. The test results showing empathy in the 2nd percentile, the detailed documentation of narcissistic traits and antisocial thinking patterns, the conclusion that rehabilitation potential was guarded at best. Judge Hawthorne had presided over her share of difficult sentencing hearings, but this one felt different because she'd watched Marcus throughout the trial, had seen his smirk when victims' photos were shown, had heard him describe the murders like he was recounting a grocery list, had witnessed his complete inability to connect with the pain he'd caused, and she'd come to a conclusion that troubled her deeply. This wasn't a child who'd made a mistake. This was someone whose moral architecture was fundamentally broken, and the question before her was whether the law had tools to address that reality. On the morning of the sentencing hearing, the courthouse was more packed than it had been for the verdict. News vans lined the street. Protesters held signs with conflicting messages: justice for James and Linda competed with kids are not adults, and rehabilitation not revenge. Inside, security was heightened. Metal detectors processed a line of people that stretched around the building. The courtroom filled to capacity an hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin. Helen Park sat in her usual spot, flanked by family members, all of them wearing photos of James and Linda pinned to their clothing. David Chen was notably absent again. He'd left the state the day after the verdict, unable to face what was coming. Marcus was brought in at exactly 9 o'clock. He wore the same outfit he'd worn during trial: khaki pants, button-down shirt, navy sweater. His attorney had insisted on it. Maintain the image of a child. Even now, he sat at the defense table and looked around the courtroom with what could only be described as mild interest, like this was all still happening to someone else, like he was an observer rather than the subject of the proceedings. The gallery watched him with barely concealed hostility. A few people made sounds of disgust that the bailiffs had to quiet. The tension was explosive. Everyone was waiting to see what Judge Patricia Hawthorne would do. The judge entered at 9:15. Everyone stood. She took her seat and surveyed the packed courtroom. Her expression was unreadable, but those who knew her well could see something different in her demeanor, a kind of resolved determination. She'd made her decision, and based on the carefully prepared statement sitting on her bench, it was going to be significant. She began with standard procedures, acknowledging the guilty verdict, confirming Marcus understood his rights, asking if either side was ready to proceed. Both confirmed they were. Then Judge Hawthorne looked directly at Marcus. Before we begin with statements, I want to address the defendant directly. Mr. Chen, in all my years on this bench, I have presided over cases involving juveniles who committed serious crimes. I have seen children who acted out in rage, in fear, in moments of terrible judgment. I have seen rehabilitation work. I have seen young people transform. But I have also seen cases where the individual, despite their age, demonstrates characteristics that make rehabilitation unlikely. And your case, Mr. Chen, has presented this court with questions that go to the heart of what justice means. She continued, her voice measured but firm. You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence against you was overwhelming, but more concerning than the evidence was your behavior throughout these proceedings, your complete lack of remorse, your inability to demonstrate even basic empathy for the victims or their family, your treatment of this trial as an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. That behavior has informed this court's consideration of what sentence is appropriate, because sentencing isn't just about punishment, it's about protection, about ensuring that justice is served not just for what has happened, but for what might happen in the future. And that is what I've spent this past week considering. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be typing more quietly. Judge Hawthorne nodded to the prosecution. We'll now hear victim impact statements. Ms. Brennan? Jessica Brennan stood and called Helen Park to the podium. Helen walked slowly, supported by her husband. She carried her written statement in shaking hands. She looked at Marcus once, just once, and he stared back with that same blank expression. She looked away quickly, focusing instead on the judge, and then she began to read. Your Honor, my sister Linda was the kindest person I've ever known. She taught 2nd grade for 32 years. She gave every student in her class a book on the last day of school, bought with her own money. She remembered their names decades later. She sent birthday cards to her former students when they got married. She was the person person everyone called when they needed help, and she never said no. Helen's voice broke. She paused, composed herself, continued. When my nephew needed a home, Linda didn't hesitate. She was 68 years old. She could have said she'd already raised her child, that she'd earned her rest, but she didn't, because that's who she was. She saw a child who needed her, and she opened her home. Helen described the last conversation she'd had with her sister. Linda's optimism about Marcus, her belief that love and structure would be enough. She died believing she was helping him, died thinking she was making a difference. And that breaks my heart in ways I can't even express, because my sister's kindness was used against her. Her love was treated as weakness, and the last thing she felt in this world was probably betrayal by someone she'd sacrificed everything to save. Helen looked at Marcus again. I don't understand you. I don't understand how someone could do what you did to people who only showed you kindness, and I don't think I ever will. But I hope this court understands that what you took from us can never be replaced. My sister will never meet her future grandchildren. She'll never finish the book series she was reading. She'll never plant another season in her garden. You took all of that, and you don't even care. She stepped down, crying too hard to continue. More statements followed. James's friends, Linda's book club members, neighbors who described the hole left in their community. Each statement painted a picture of two ordinary people who'd done nothing to deserve what happened to them, who'd simply been good, decent humans trying to do the right thing, and each statement emphasized the same point. Marcus had shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of the harm, no indication that he understood the permanence of what he'd done. By the time the victim's statements concluded, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except for Marcus. He sat at the defense table taking occasional notes, his expression never changing, his capacity for human connection apparently non-existent. Judge Hawthorne thanked the victims' families for their statements. Then she turned to the defense. Ms. Santos, does your client wish to make a statement? Rebecca Santos stood. She'd prepared Marcus as best she could, but she knew what was likely to happen. Yes, Your Honor. Marcus would like to address the court. Marcus stood and walked to the podium. The room seemed to lean forward collectively. This was it. His final opportunity to show something human, something redeemable, something that might save him from the harshest possible sentence. He looked down at the notes his attorney had helped him prepare. Then he looked up at Judge Hawthorne, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and emotionless. Exactly what everyone feared, and exactly what sealed his fate. Marcus Chen stood at the podium with his prepared statement in front of him. The courtroom held its breath. Every eye was fixed on the 14-year-old boy who'd murdered his grandparents and shown no remorse. This was his final chance, his last opportunity to demonstrate that somewhere beneath that flat affect and cold demeanor was a human being capable of understanding the gravity of what he'd done. Rebecca Santos watched from the defense table with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She'd told him what to say, how to say it, but she couldn't control what he would actually do, and based on every interaction she'd had with him over the past months, she knew this could go terribly wrong. Marcus looked down at his notes. Then he looked at Judge Hawthorne and began to speak. Your Honor, I understand that I've been found guilty of killing my grandparents. I understand that what happened was serious and that people are upset about it. My attorney has told me that I should express remorse and explain that I understand the harm I caused. He paused. Rebecca Santos closed her eyes. That phrasing, my attorney has told me, was exactly what she'd warned him not to say. It made everything sound scripted, insincere, tactical. But Marcus continued, seemingly unaware of how his words were landing. I do understand that James and Linda Chen are dead and won't come back. I understand that their family is sad and angry. I wish things had turned out differently. I wish things had turned out differently. Not, I wish I hadn't done it. Not, I'm devastated by what I did. Just a passive construction that suggested he was somehow separate from the events, like he was commenting on a natural disaster rather than his own actions. Several jurors who'd remained in the gallery for sentencing exchanged glances. This was exactly what they'd seen during trial. This complete inability to take ownership or express genuine emotion. Marcus looked back down at his notes. I know that I'll have to face consequences for my actions. I accept that. I hope that someday I can prove that I'm not the person everyone thinks I am. He paused again. That's all I have to say. He returned to his seat. The whole statement had taken less than 90 seconds, and it had been catastrophically inadequate. Judge Hawthorne's expression darkened. She'd given him every opportunity, had watched him deliver a statement that sounded like it had been generated by someone researching what remorse should sound like rather than actually feeling it. She looked at Rebecca Santos. Does the defense wish to present any additional evidence or argument before sentencing? Santos stood. She knew this was hopeless, but she had to try. Your Honor, the defense asks the court to consider Marcus's age and the possibility of rehabilitation. situation. While we acknowledge that his emotional presentation has been problematic, we believe that with intensive therapy and appropriate intervention, there is still hope for change. We ask the court to impose a juvenile sentence with review at age 21, giving Marcus the opportunity to demonstrate growth and transformation. Judge Hawthorne nodded. The court has considered that possibility extensively, Ms. Santos. Is there anything else? Santos hesitated, then made one final plea. Your Honor, the Supreme Court has consistently held that juveniles are different, that children have greater capacity for change than adults, that even those who commit serious crimes deserve the possibility of redemption. Marcus is 14 years old. Sentencing him to effective life imprisonment would be declaring that a child is irredeemable. The defense respectfully asks the court not to make that declaration. She sat down. It was a good argument, legally sound, morally compelling. Under normal circumstances, it would carry weight, but these weren't normal circumstances, and Judge Hawthorne was about to make that very clear. Ms. Brennan, sentencing recommendation from the prosecution. Jessica Brennan stood. Your Honor, the prosecution recommends the maximum allowable sentence under juvenile statutes with special circumstances consideration. 2 consecutive life sentences with eligibility for parole review at age 40. We believe this adequately balances the defendant's age with the severity of the crimes and the complete absence of rehabilitative potential demonstrated throughout these proceedings. The defendant has shown no remorse, has expressed no genuine understanding of the harm he caused, and every psychological evaluation suggests that he presents an ongoing danger to society. The victims' families deserve to know that justice has been served, and future potential victims deserve to be protected from someone who has demonstrated a profound inability to value human life. Judge Hawthorne thanked the prosecution. Then she sat back in her chair and was silent for a long moment. The courtroom remained frozen, waiting. Finally, she leaned forward and began to speak, and what she said would be quoted in law journals, debated in legal circles, and cited in cases for years to come. I have presided over this court for 6 years. Before that, I was a prosecutor for 15 years. In that time, I have encountered individuals who committed terrible acts for understandable, if not excusable, reasons. Rage, fear, desperation, mental illness, trauma. I have seen people at their absolute worst, and I have always believed that our justice system should prioritize rehabilitation when possible, that we should offer second chances, that we should recognize the difference between adults and children. I still believe those things, but this case has forced me to confront a difficult truth. She looked directly at Marcus. Some individuals do not fit neatly into our frameworks for understanding criminal behavior. Some individuals demonstrate characteristics that transcend age and circumstance, and when we encounter those individuals, we must make decisions based not on what we wish were true, but on what the evidence proves to be true. Mr. Chen, you are 14 years old. Chronologically, you are a child, but chronologically is the only way in which you resemble one. Throughout these proceedings, I have watched you carefully. I have observed your complete lack of emotional response to testimony about your victims. I have noted your inability to demonstrate basic empathy even when directly confronted with the pain you caused. I have read Dr. Foster's evaluation describing you as the most psychologically detached minor he has encountered in 28 years of practice. Judge Hawthorne's voice remained measured but grew more intense. You murdered your grandparents while they slept. You sat in a chair and watched to make sure they were dead. You hid the weapon. You walked away calmly. And when police found you, you showed no concern for their welfare. No tears, no fear, no humanity. You researched sentencing guidelines for juvenile offenders weeks before the murders, demonstrating that you planned ahead and calculated that your age would protect you from serious consequences. You searched, "Do people suffer quickly?" 3 days before executing 2 people who had shown you nothing but kindness. And when given the opportunity to explain yourself, you described feeling trapped by reasonable rules and controlled by grandparents who only wanted to keep you safe. She paused, letting her words sink in. During your testimony, you admitted to the murders with less emotion than most people show when discussing a parking ticket. You told this court that you felt bad about getting caught, not about the deaths. And just moments ago, you delivered a statement so devoid of genuine remorse that it actually made your situation worse. You didn't say you were sorry. You said you wish things had turned out differently, as if you were a passive observer rather than the person who made the active choice to end 2 lives. Mr. Chen, I don't believe you lack intelligence. I believe you understand that you're supposed to show remorse. You just don't feel it. And that incapacity is far more dangerous than any rage or hatred could ever be. Judge Hawthorne pulled out a thick document. I have spent the past week researching juvenile sentencing law in this state and across the country. I have reviewed Supreme Court precedent regarding the treatment of juvenile offenders. I have studied cases similar to yours, and I have consulted with experts in juvenile justice, psychology, and criminal law. The Supreme Court has held that mandatory life without parole for juveniles is unconstitutional, that juveniles must be given some opportunity for release. But the court has also recognized that sentencing courts must consider the individual circumstances of each case, the nature of the crime, the defendant's culpability, and critically, the likelihood of rehabilitation. She looked at the packed courtroom. Rehabilitation is the cornerstone of juvenile justice. We recognize that children's brains are still developing, that they have greater capacity for change than adults, that mistakes made at 14 should not define a person's entire life. I agree with those principles completely, but rehabilitation requires something fundamental. It requires the capacity to change, and every piece of evidence in this case suggests that Marcus Chen lacks that capacity. He doesn't just need time to mature. He needs something that time alone cannot provide. He needs a fundamental rewiring of his moral and emotional architecture, and our current understanding of psychology suggests that such rewiring may not be possible. Judge Hawthorne's voice grew firmer. The defense has argued that Marcus deserves the opportunity to prove he can change, but opportunities must be earned through at least minimal demonstration of potential. Marcus has shown none, not during his time with his grandparents, not during pretrial evaluation, not during trial, not today. He has had countless chances to demonstrate even the smallest flicker of remorse, empathy, or human connection. He has failed every single time, not because he's inarticulate, not because he's traumatized, but because he fundamentally does not care. And a justice system that ignores that reality in favor of idealized notions of childhood innocence is a system that fails to protect society. She picked up another document. California law allows juvenile offenders convicted of special circumstances murder to be sentenced to 25 years to life. The law also contains provisions that recognize some offenses are so serious and some offenders so dangerous that extended sentences are necessary even for minors. After careful consideration of all factors, the premeditation, the vulnerability of the victims, the defendant's complete lack of remorse, and the professional opinions of multiple experts regarding his psychological state, this court finds that Marcus Chen represents an exceptional case requiring an exceptional response. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Judge Hawthorne looked at Marcus. Marcus James Chen, you are hereby sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 25 years to life for the first-degree murders of James Chen and Linda Chen. This results in a total sentence of 50 years to life. You will be eligible to petition for parole after serving a minimum of 50 years in custody. At that time, you will be 64 years old. The parole board will evaluate whether you have demonstrated genuine rehabilitation, remorse, and understanding of your crimes. Until such demonstration is made, you will remain incarcerated. Gasps filled the courtroom. Rebecca Santos was on her feet immediately. Your Honor, I must object. That sentence effectively denies my client any meaningful opportunity for release during his productive lifetime. It violates the spirit of Supreme Court precedent regarding juvenile sentencing. Judge Hawthorne's expression was steel. Your objection is noted for the record, Ms. Santos, but this sentence does not violate Supreme Court precedent. Your client has the opportunity for parole review. He is not sentenced to mandatory life without parole. He is sentenced to a term that reflects the severity of his crimes and the assessment of multiple experts that his rehabilitative potential is minimal to non-existent. If Marcus Chen demonstrates genuine transformation over the next 50 years, the parole board can release him. This court believes that timeline is appropriate given the complete absence of any rehabilitative indicators. She continued, furthermore, this court is imposing additional conditions. During his incarceration, Marcus will undergo annual psychological evaluation evaluations. He will participate in mandatory therapy focused on developing empathy and emotional connection, assuming such therapy proves possible. He will take courses in ethics, philosophy, and the impact of crime on victims. And he will write annual reflections on his crimes to be reviewed by the parole board. These conditions are designed to provide maximum opportunity for the transformation that has thus far been entirely absent. If Marcus genuinely changes, if he develops the capacity for remorse and empathy that he currently lacks, the documentation will exist to support his eventual release. But absent such change, society deserves protection from someone who has proven himself to be profoundly dangerous. Helen Park collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing with what sounded like relief. Others in the gallery openly wept. Some nodded with grim satisfaction. Marcus sat at the defense table with the same blank expression he'd worn throughout. 50 years. He'd be 64. His entire life, effectively over. And his response was to lean over to Rebecca Santos and whisper something that made her close her eyes in frustration. Later, when asked by reporters what he'd said, Santos would only respond. He asked if the 50 years could be served concurrently instead of consecutively. Even then, he was negotiating. Even then, he didn't understand. Judge Hawthorne wasn't finished. Let me be clear about why this sentence is necessary. It's not about vengeance. It's not about giving up on a child. It's about acknowledging reality. Marcus Chen planned and executed a double homicide with calculation that would be chilling in an adult and is absolutely unprecedented in a juvenile. He has demonstrated psychological characteristics that multiple experts describe as deeply pathological and unlikely to respond to conventional intervention. He has shown zero capacity for the emotional growth that rehabilitation requires. This court cannot, in good conscience, impose a sentence that would allow him to re-enter society in 7 years when nothing, absolutely nothing, suggests he would be any less dangerous then than he is now. She looked at the gallery. To the victim's family, I want you to know that this court has heard you, has seen your pain, has recognized the magnitude of what was taken from you. This sentence will not bring James and Linda back. It will not erase the horror of what happened. But it does ensure that the person responsible will face consequences proportionate to his crimes, and it ensures that he cannot harm anyone else unless and until he demonstrates genuine transformation. Helen Park nodded through her tears, mouthing thank you to the judge. Judge Hawthorne nodded back, a small moment of human connection in an otherwise devastating proceeding. To the community, I want to emphasize that this sentence is not a template for all juvenile cases. It is specific to this defendant and these circumstances. I still believe in rehabilitation for young offenders. I still believe that most children who commit crimes deserve second chances. But most does not mean all, and this case represents the rare exception where age cannot override the overwhelming evidence of danger and absence of rehabilitative capacity. Our justice system must be flexible enough to recognize when standard approaches are inadequate. This is one of those times. She paused. And to Marcus Chen, I'll say this. You have 50 years to prove me wrong. 50 years to develop the empathy and remorse you currently lack. 50 years to become the person who deserves a second chance. I genuinely hope you do. I hope that decades from now you look back on this moment with genuine horror at what you did. I hope you develop the capacity to mourn your grandparents, to understand what you took from the world when you killed them, because if you do, you may eventually earn your freedom. But until then, society deserves protection from what you are right now. Judge Hawthorne stood. This court stands adjourned. She banged her gavel once. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a final punctuation mark. She gathered her documents and exited through her chambers. The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. Reporters rushed out to file stories. Family members embraced. Marcus was led away by bailiffs, his expression still maddeningly neutral. As he passed the gallery, he looked at his Aunt Helen one last time. She stared back, searching his face for something, anything that resembled recognition or regret. She found nothing, just that same blank stare. And then he was gone, disappearing through the side door toward a future that would be measured in decades behind bars. The sentence made national headlines within minutes. 14-year-old receives 50 years to life for murdering grandparents. Legal experts debated its constitutionality. Victim advocacy groups praised Judge Hawthorne's courage. Juvenile justice advocates criticized it as too harsh. But everyone agreed on one thing. This case would be studied for years, would be cited in future sentencing hearings, would reshape conversations about juvenile culpability and the limits of rehabilitation. Judge Patricia Hawthorne had made legal history. Not because she wanted to, but because Marcus Chen had given her no choice. Because sometimes the law has to bend to accommodate the reality that not every child is innocent, that not every young person can be saved, and that sometimes justice requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about human nature. The gavel had fallen. The sentence was delivered. And Marcus Chen would spend the next 50 years living with consequences he still didn't seem to fully comprehend. His smile had finally disappeared, but not because he understood, because there was nothing left to smile about. The courthouse steps became a stage for raw emotion within minutes of the sentencing. Helen Park emerged first, supported by her family, her face red and swollen from crying. Reporters swarmed immediately, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. She raised one hand, asking for space, and the crowd gave her just enough room to speak. Her voice was hoarse but determined. My sister Linda believed in second chances. She believed that love could fix anything, and that belief got her killed. She paused, composing herself. I'm grateful to Judge Hawthorne for seeing through Marcus's act, for recognizing that some people can't be fixed. Linda and James deserved better than to die in their own bed, murdered by someone they were trying to save. This sentence doesn't bring them back, but it means their killer won't get to live the life they should have lived. That's the closest thing to justice we'll ever get. A reporter shouted a question about whether 50 years was too harsh for a 14-year-old. Helen's expression hardened. Too harsh? My sister was 68 years old. She had maybe 20 good years left. Marcus took all of them. He took her future grandchildren, her retirement, her happiness, and he did it without blinking. Age doesn't excuse that. Nothing excuses that. Her husband guided her away from the microphones toward a waiting car. As they drove off, Helen looked back at the courthouse one final time. The building where her sister's killer had finally faced consequences. It didn't feel like closure. Closure would require understanding why, and she'd never understand why. But it was something. It was acknowledgement that what happened mattered, that Linda and James mattered. And for now, that would have to be enough. Rebecca Santos held her own press conference an hour later. She stood at a podium outside the courthouse looking exhausted and defeated. Today's sentence is a miscarriage of justice, she began, reading from a prepared statement. Marcus Chen is a child, a 14-year-old child sentenced to effective life imprisonment. While we acknowledge the severity of the crimes, we strongly believe that this sentence violates the spirit of Supreme Court precedent requiring that juveniles be given meaningful opportunity for rehabilitation and release. We will be filing an appeal. She took questions. One reporter asked if Marcus had shown any reaction to the sentence. Santos paused. My client is processing what happened. He's 14 years old, facing 50 years in prison. That's devastating for anyone. But her answer felt hollow. Because the truth was, Marcus hadn't shown much reaction at all. Just that same flat affect, that same detachment, even facing half a century behind bars. Legal analysts filled cable news shows within hours. The debate was fierce and divided. Professor David Martinez from Stanford Law appeared on CNN. This sentence sets a dangerous precedent. We're talking about a child whose brain won't be fully developed for another decade. The whole point of juvenile justice reform has been recognizing that children are different, that they deserve different treatment. This sentence essentially declares that 14-year-old Marcus Chen is irredeemable. That's not justice. That's giving up. He was countered by former prosecutor Janet Williams. With all respect to Professor Martinez, this isn't about giving up. It's about recognizing reality. Marcus Chen planned and executed a double homicide. He's been evaluated by multiple experts who all say the same thing. He lacks basic empathy. He shows no remorse. At some point, we have to acknowledge that rehabilitation requires the capacity to be rehabilitated, and nothing suggests Marcus has that capacity. The debate raged on social media with equal intensity. The hashtag Justice for Marcus trended alongside Justice for James and Linda. People shared their opinions with certainty and passion. Some saw a child railroaded by a system that should have protected him. Others saw a dangerous individual appropriately sentenced for horrific crimes. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any hashtag could capture. But nuance didn't survive in the digital age. You were either for harsh juvenile sentencing or against it. You either believed in redemption or you didn't. The gray area where Marcus Chen actually existed. Neither sympathetic victim nor Hollywood villain, just deeply broken in ways that defied easy categorization. That space collapsed under the weight of public opinion. The juvenile detention facility where Marcus had been held transferred him to a state youth correctional facility within days. He would remain there until age 18, then transferred to adult prison for the remainder of his sentence. The facility administrator, a woman named Carol Jenkins with 20 years of experience working with juvenile offenders, received Marcus personally. She'd read his case file, read the psychological evaluations, watched news coverage of the trial, and she'd never seen anything quite like it. During intake processing, she asked Marcus how he was feeling. He said he was fine. She asked if he understood what had happened in court. He said yes, he'd been sentenced to 50 years. She asked if he had any questions. He asked when he could access the library. Nothing about appeals, nothing about his family, just practical questions about daily routine. Carol had seen a lot in her career, but she'd never seen someone so young show such complete emotional detachment from consequences that would define the rest of their life. David Chen checked himself back into rehab 2 days after the sentencing. He'd stayed sober through the trial, but the moment the verdict came down, the weight of it all had become unbearable. His son was going to prison for 50 years. His parents were dead. His failures had cascaded into tragedy beyond anything he could have imagined. The rehab facility admitted him immediately. His counselor, a man named Tom Rodriguez, had worked with addicts dealing with family trauma before, but even he struggled with how to approach this particular situation. How do you process guilt when your addiction contributed to your son becoming a murderer and your parents becoming victims? Tom asked during a staff meeting. Nobody had a good answer. David would spend the next 6 months in intensive treatment, trying to figure out how to live with what his choices had set in motion. Whether he succeeded would remain to be seen. The house at 847 Maple Ridge Drive sat empty for months. Helen couldn't bear to enter it. The estate was tied up in legal proceedings. Eventually, she hired a company to clear it out. Workers packed up James and Linda's belongings with care. Clothes donated, furniture sold, photos preserved for family, but nobody wanted to live there. The house where 2 people had been murdered in their sleep wasn't somewhere anyone could build happy memories. It finally sold 8 months later to an investor who planned to renovate and flip it. The new owners would never know exactly which bedroom had been the crime scene. The carpet had been replaced, the walls repainted, the physical evidence of tragedy erased. But neighbors remembered, would always remember, and property values on Maple Ridge Drive dropped slightly that year. Death had a way of lingering even after all visible traces disappeared. Judge Patricia Hawthorne faced both praise and criticism in the weeks following the sentencing. She received hundreds of letters. Some thanked her for her courage, for making a hard decision that prioritized public safety. Others condemned her for sentencing a child so harshly, for abandoning the principles of rehabilitation and redemption. Death threats arrived from people who'd never attended the trial but had strong opinions about what justice should look like. The court had to increase security around her home and chambers. But Hawthorne had been a judge long enough to know that controversial decisions came with controversy. She read every letter, considered every argument, and remained convinced that she'd made the right call. Because she'd sat through that entire trial, had watched Marcus firsthand, had seen what everyone else had seen. and no amount of theoretical arguments about juvenile justice could override the evidence of her own observations. She gave one interview to a legal journal 3 months after the sentencing. "People want to know if I struggle with the decision," she said, "and the answer is yes. Of course I do. Sentencing a 14-year-old to 50 years isn't something anyone does lightly, but I struggle more with the alternative, with what might have happened if I'd sentenced him to 7 years with review at 21. Because nothing, and I mean nothing, in his psychological profile, his behavior, or his own statements suggests he would have been any different at 21 than he is now. Would I have been comfortable releasing someone who'd shown zero rehabilitation, zero remorse, zero change, knowing he might harm someone else? That's the question that haunted me, and the answer was no. I couldn't do it. So I crafted a sentence that gives him decades to prove he can change while ensuring society is protected if he can't." The interviewer asked about the criticism that her sentence abandoned hope for juvenile rehabilitation. Hawthorne shook her head. "I haven't abandoned hope for rehabilitation. I've abandoned the pretense that it's automatic, that it's guaranteed just because someone is young. Real rehabilitation requires work, self-reflection, development of empathy and moral reasoning. Marcus has 50 years to do that work. If he genuinely transforms, the parole board can release him. But that transformation has to be real, documented, demonstrable, not performed for a parole hearing, but genuine change in how he thinks and feels. That's not abandoning hope. That's setting appropriate standards." The interview was published and sparked another round of debate. But Hawthorne was done defending herself. She'd made her decision, written her reasoning, and moved on to her next case. The victim's family gradually found ways to move forward. Helen established a scholarship fund in Linda and James's names. It would provide money for college to students who'd been raised by their grandparents, a small way of honoring the sacrifice Linda and James had made. The first scholarship was awarded 9 months after their deaths to a girl who'd been raised by her grandmother after her mother's incarceration. At the ceremony, Helen spoke about her sister's belief in second chances, in doing the right thing even when it was hard. "Linda would want something good to come from this tragedy," Helen said. "She'd want other children who need their grandparents to get the help Marcus couldn't accept. It wasn't much. It wouldn't bring them back. But it was purpose. It was meaning carved from senseless loss. And it helped Helen wake up each morning with something besides grief to focus on." Patricia Gonzalez, the neighbor who'd made the original 911 call, moved away 6 months after the trial. She couldn't look at that house anymore. Couldn't walk past it without remembering that morning. The stillness, the wrongness, the way she'd known something terrible had happened before she had any proof. She sold her house at a loss and relocated across town. Her new neighbors didn't know her history with the case, didn't know she'd been the one to discover that something was wrong, and she preferred it that way. Some experiences marked you, changed you, made it impossible to stay in the same place and pretend everything was normal. She'd done her part, called for help, testified when needed, but she was done being part of the story, done being the neighbor who knew. She wanted to be anonymous again, to live somewhere without tragedy soaked into the street. The case was cited in legal journals within months. Law schools used it as a teaching example in juvenile justice classes. Students debated whether Judge Hawthorne had acted appropriately or exceeded her authority. Professors used it to illustrate the tension between rehabilitation and public safety, between seeing juveniles as inherently redeemable and recognizing that some cases defy standard frameworks. The case became shorthand in legal circles. It's a Marcus Chen situation, meaning a case where the defendant's age conflicted with their demonstrated level of premeditation and absence of remorse. Other judges facing similar cases would cite Judge Hawthorne's reasoning. Some would follow her approach. Others would reject it. but everyone agreed it had changed the conversation about juvenile sentencing in meaningful ways. Marcus himself adapted to incarceration with the same detachment he'd shown throughout the trial. Facility staff reported that he followed rules, completed assignments, participated in required programs, but he remained emotionally flat, disconnected. During therapy sessions, he could articulate the right concepts, could describe what empathy should feel like, what remorse should sound like. But his therapist noted in reports that it all felt performative. He's learned the vocabulary of emotion without accessing the actual feelings, one report stated. He can tell you what he should feel. He just can't feel it. The annual psychological evaluations required by his sentence all reached similar conclusions. No meaningful change, no development of genuine empathy, continued narcissistic and antisocial traits. The boy was growing older, but he wasn't growing in the ways that mattered. 5 years after the sentencing, a documentary crew requested permission to interview Marcus. The prison denied it. 10 years later, a journalist wrote a book about the case. It became a bestseller, reigniting debates about juvenile justice and the nature of evil. 15 years later, Marcus would be 30, still in prison, still showing minimal emotional growth according to evaluation reports, still decades away from any possibility of release. James and Linda Chen would have been 87 and 83, would likely have passed away from natural causes by then. But they didn't get that chance, didn't get to grow old gradually, didn't get to decide when their story ended. That decision had been made for them by someone who thought a curfew was worth killing over. The aftermath of the case continued to ripple outward. Changed laws, changed lives, changed conversations about justice and mercy, and whether some people were beyond saving. But at the center of it all remained a simple, devastating truth. 2 good people had died. A broken child had killed them. And no sentence, no debate, no documentary or scholarship fund could change those fundamental facts. The aftermath was just everyone left behind, trying to find meaning in the meaningless, trying to build something from the rubble, trying to believe that justice had been served when nothing could truly balance the scales. Because you can't balance death. You can only acknowledge it, honor it, and try to prevent it from happening again. That was the real legacy of James and Linda Chen. Not the trial, not the sentence, but the reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it just smiles and waits for you to fall asleep. 20 years after the sentencing, the courtroom where Marcus Chen was convicted sat empty on a Tuesday afternoon. The same chairs, the same judge's bench, the same witness stand where a 14-year-old boy had admitted to murder without emotion. Judge Patricia Hawthorne had retired 5 years earlier, her career defined in large part by the decision she'd made that spring day when she sentenced a child to 50 years. She'd never expressed regret. In interviews years later, she'd simply said, "I did what the evidence demanded, what society deserved, and what Marcus Chen's own behavior proved was necessary." The courtroom had seen hundreds of cases since then, but courthouse staff still referred to it as the Chen courtroom. Some cases marked a space, changed it, made it impossible to forget what had happened within its walls. Marcus Chen was 34 years old when the California Board of Parole Hearings reviewed his case for the first time. It wasn't a parole hearing. He had 26 more years before he'd be eligible for that. But the law required periodic review of juvenile sentences to ensure they remained appropriate. 3 board members sat across from Marcus in a secure meeting room at the state prison where he'd been housed since turning 18. He was no longer the small-framed boy who'd sat in that courtroom. He was a grown man now, taller, broader, with the kind of hardness that came from 2 decades in prison. But his eyes remained the same, flat, disconnected, looking through people rather than at them. The board chair, a woman named Margaret Foster, reviewed his file. 20 years of psychological evaluations, 20 years of therapy reports, 20 years of behavioral documentation. The pattern was consistent and troubling. Marcus had learned to function in prison, had no disciplinary infractions, completed education programs, earned certificates in various vocational skills. But every psychological evaluation reached the same conclusion: no meaningful emotional development, no genuine remorse, no capacity for empathy beyond intellectual understanding. He could define empathy, could describe what remorse should look like, but he couldn't demonstrate feeling it. After 2 decades of intervention, therapy, and programming, Marcus Chen remained fundamentally the same person who'd sat in that chair and watched his grandparents die. "Mr. Chen," Margaret began, "you've now served 20 years of your sentence. You were 14 when the crime occurred. You're 34 now. That's an entire lifetime of incarceration. Can you tell this board what you've learned about yourself during that time?" Marcus answered with the same measured tone he'd used in court 2 decades earlier. "I've learned a lot about how the prison system works, about how to function in here. I've completed every program I was assigned. I've worked in the library. I've taken college courses through correspondence. I've done everything that was asked of me." Margaret waited. When he didn't continue, she prompted, "And what have you learned about your crimes, about James and Linda Chen?" Marcus paused, as if accessing a script he'd memorized. "I understand that what I did was wrong, that I took 2 lives that can't be replaced, that I caused suffering to their family and community. I understand the permanence of death and the impact of my actions." The words were correct. The delivery was hollow. Margaret exchanged glances with the other board members. They'd all read the evaluations. They knew what they were seeing. This was someone who'd learned the language of rehabilitation without experiencing the transformation. "Mr. Chen, do you feel remorse for killing your grandparents?" Marcus looked at her directly. "I understand that I should feel remorse. The therapists have explained what that means, I think, about what happened regularly. I wish it hadn't occurred." "You wish it hadn't occurred," Margaret repeated. "That's different from wishing you hadn't done it. Can you articulate the difference?" Marcus seemed genuinely confused by the distinction. "Aren't they the same thing?" And that response, more than any evaluation or report, captured the fundamental problem. After 20 years of intervention, Marcus still couldn't grasp the difference between regretting an outcome and taking ownership of his actions, between wishing circumstances were different and genuinely mourning the people he'd killed. The board concluded their review quickly. Their recommendation was unanimous. Sentence remains appropriate, no modification warranted. Psychological intervention should continue. Marcus would remain exactly where he was. Helen Park was 53 when Marcus went to prison. She was 73 when she received notification of the sentence review. She didn't attend, didn't want to see him, didn't want to hear whatever rehearsed remorse he'd prepared. She'd moved on as much as someone could move on from that kind of loss. The scholarship fund she'd established had helped 43 students over 2 decades, young people raised by grandparents who needed financial help to pursue education. At award ceremonies, Helen always told Linda and James's story, not the murder, not the trial, but who they were before, the kindness, the dedication, the belief in helping family. "They would have loved seeing you succeed," she'd tell the recipients. "They believed in second chances, in doing the right thing. That's their legacy." She never mentioned Marcus by name at these events. He didn't deserve to be part of the story of their goodness. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been sold 3 more times since the murders. Each owner learned the history eventually. Neighbors would mention it, or they'd Google the address and find old news articles. Most people handled it with appropriate solemnity. But the house had become just another house. The horror had faded into the floorboards. Kids played in the yard. Families had cookouts on the back patio. Life continued in the space where death had once stopped it. Patricia Gonzalez drove past it once, years after moving away. She'd been in the neighborhood visiting a friend and took a deliberate detour to see it. The house was painted a different color now. Different cars in the driveway, different people living completely different lives. She felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the space wasn't frozen in tragedy. Sadness that the world moved on so easily from something that had permanently altered her. David Chen died 11 years after his son's conviction. Cirrhosis of the liver, the final consequence of a lifetime of addiction. He'd managed 2 more years of sobriety after that rehab stint following the trial. Then relapsed. Dried out again. Relapsed worse. The cycle continued until his body simply gave out. He was 53 years old. In his final days, heavily medicated in a hospital bed, he asked repeatedly for his son. Wanted to see Marcus one more time. Wanted to tell him something, though what he wanted to say remained unclear. Prison officials denied the request. Marcus showed no particular reaction when informed of his father's death. "Okay," he said. Nothing more. His therapist noted it in his file. Informed of father's passing. Response minimal. No emotional processing observed. Just another data point in 2 decades of data points, all pointing to the same conclusion. Rebecca Santos, Marcus's defense attorney, left criminal law 3 years after the trial. She couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't represent clients she didn't believe in. Couldn't defend actions she found indefensible. The Chen case had broken something in her. Not because she'd lost plenty of cases before, but because she'd watched a 14-year-old boy demonstrate such profound absence of humanity that it had shaken her faith in rehabilitation. She moved to family law, helped with custody disputes and divorces, problems that were painful but human, that involved people who felt things, who cried and argued and expressed emotions that made sense even when they were difficult. She never spoke publicly about the Chen case, but colleagues knew it had changed her, knew it was the reason she'd walked away from the work she'd spent 15 years building. Jessica Brennan, the prosecutor, became a judge herself 8 years after the trial. She'd handled dozens of difficult cases in her career, but the Chen case remained the one people asked about, the one that defined her reputation. "You're the prosecutor who got 50 years for a 14-year-old, people would say. As if it were an accomplishment. As if she'd been trying to set records rather than pursuing justice. She'd correct them when she could. I asked for what the evidence supported. Judge Hawthorne made the final decision. But she stood by that decision completely, had watched Marcus throughout the trial, had seen what everyone saw. And unlike some people who softened their views with distance and time, Brennan only became more convinced she'd been right. The sentence reviews that came every few years, all reporting no meaningful change in Marcus, only confirmed it. Dr. Raymond Foster, the psychologist who'd evaluated Marcus before trial, retired at 78 after 46 years of practice. In his final interview with a professional journal, he was asked about the most memorable case of his career. He didn't hesitate. Marcus Chen, not because of the crime itself, though that was horrific, but because of what he represented, the question of whether someone could be fundamentally incapable of empathy from such a young age. I've evaluated thousands of people. I've seen every diagnostic category, every presentation of mental illness and personality disorder, but I'd never seen a child who was so absent, not troubled, not disturbed, just absent of the basic emotional hardware that makes us human. The case forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about nature versus nurture, about whether some people are simply born without the capacity for moral reasoning. I don't have answers, but Marcus Chen made me ask the questions. Judge Patricia Hawthorne was 71 when she sat in her home office reviewing letters she'd received over the years about the Chen case. Hundreds of them. She'd kept them all, filed carefully by year. Some expressed gratitude for her courage. Some expressed fury at her cruelty. Some were from other judges seeking advice on similar cases. Some were from victims' families who felt seen and heard. Some were from juvenile justice advocates who saw her as everything wrong with the system. She read through them occasionally, not because she doubted herself, but because she wanted to remember the weight of the decision, wanted to honor the complexity of what she'd been forced to navigate, wanted to ensure she never forgot that sentencing wasn't abstract. It was real people, real lives, real consequences. She'd been contacted twice about interviews for documentaries about the case, declined both, had been asked to speak at legal conferences about juvenile sentencing, declined most, accepted a few. When she did speak, she was always careful to emphasize that the Chen case was an outlier. "I don't want my decision to be used as justification for harsh treatment of all juvenile offenders," she'd say. "The vast majority of young people who commit crimes can be rehabilitated, should be given second chances. The Chen case was different because Marcus Chen was different, provably, documentably, fundamentally different. That's why the sentence was appropriate, not as a template, but as recognition that the law must be flexible enough to address exceptional circumstances." Whether people listened to that nuance or just heard "judge who sentenced 14-year-old to 50 years" varied, but she kept trying to make the distinction clear. Marcus turned 40, then 45. The years blended together in the monotony of prison routine. Wake up, breakfast, work assignment, lunch, yard time, dinner, lockdown, repeat. 27,300 days of the same cycle. He aged, his hairline receded, his face hardened, but the psychological evaluations remained unchanged, year after year, decade after decade. Subject continues to demonstrate profound deficits in emotional processing, can articulate concepts intellectually, but shows no evidence of genuine feeling. Prognosis for development of authentic empathy remains poor. The same conclusions written in slightly different words by different evaluators over quarter century. Marcus had become a case study, a reference point. The example people cited when asking whether some individuals were beyond rehabilitation. Helen Park died at 81. Natural causes. Surrounded by family. The scholarship fund she'd established was written into her will, endowed with enough money to continue indefinitely. At her funeral, 43 former scholarship recipients attended. Young adults now, some with children of their own, all of them carrying a piece of Linda and James's legacy forward. That legacy had nothing to do with how they died, everything to do with how they'd lived, the kindness, the sacrifice, the belief that family mattered. Helen's eulogy included a mention of her sister. Linda believed in the best of people, believed that love could fix anything. That belief was wrong in one case, but right in so many others. These students are proof of that. Proof that when good people step up for children who need them, beautiful things can happen. Marcus Chen took my sister's life, but he couldn't take her impact, couldn't erase the good she'd done. That good lives on. That's justice, too. The courtroom at the San Mateo County Superior Court underwent renovation 30 years after the trial. New carpet, new paint, updated technology. But during the renovation, workers found something behind a panel in the judge's chambers. A handwritten note, dated 3 days after Marcus Chen's sentencing, in Judge Hawthorne's precise handwriting. "I sentenced a child to 50 years today. I believe it was right. I believe it was necessary. I believe it was just. But I will carry the weight of that decision for the rest of my life. Not because I made the wrong choice, but because it was mine to make. Because the law gave me the authority to determine that a 14-year-old was beyond saving. And that authority is terrible and awesome and necessary and horrible all at once. If Marcus Chen proves me wrong, If he transforms and earns release someday, I will be genuinely happy. But I don't think he will, and that might be the saddest truth of all." The note was preserved, framed, placed in the courthouse's history collection, a reminder that justice was never simple, never clean, never without cost, that judges were human, that decisions were hard, that sometimes doing the right thing felt awful and was still right. Judge Hawthorne died at 76, 3 years after the note was discovered. Her obituary mentioned dozens of cases she'd presided over, reforms she'd advocated for, young lawyers she'd mentored. But everyone knew what she'd be remembered for: the Chen case, the sentence that changed juvenile justice law, the moment she'd looked at a 14-year-old and said, "Age is not immunity. Actions have consequences, and some people, regardless of how young they are, must be held accountable." Marcus Chen remained in prison as the decades passed. 50 years to life meant he'd be eligible for parole at 64. If he lived that long, if he demonstrated transformation, if the parole board believed he was safe to release. None of those things seemed likely. The boy who'd smiled in court was now a middle-aged man who'd spent more time in prison than out of it, who'd never experienced adult life in the free world, who'd grown old in a 6x9 cell paying for what he'd done in that bedroom at 3 a.m. when he was 14. Whether that was justice or tragedy or both depended on who you asked. But this much was certain: James and Linda Chen never got to grow old, never got to retire peacefully, never got to see grandchildren grow up. They got 3 bullets each, and death in their sleep, and a grandson who watched to make sure it worked. The poetic justice, if there was any, was that Marcus got exactly what he'd given: permanence. His grandparents' lives ended permanently at his hands. And his life, in any meaningful sense, ended permanently at that sentencing. He was alive, breathing, existing. But the future he might have had, the experiences, the relationships, the freedom, all of it disappeared the moment he pulled that trigger. He'd calculated that his age would protect him, that the system would go easy on a child. He'd been wrong, and that miscalculation cost him everything. 50 years in a cage, 50 years of monotony, 50 years of becoming exactly the institutional product that prisons create. He'd wanted freedom from his grandparents' rules. Instead, he got the most restrictive rules imaginable. Every hour scheduled, every movement is monitored, every choice made for him. It was, in its own way, perfect symmetry. The final truth about the Marcus Chen case was this: justice happened. Not the justice of fairy tales where wrongs are righted and balance is restored, but the justice of reality where consequences occur and accountability exists, and some wounds never heal. 2 good people died. Their killer went to prison for the rest of his productive life. Their family found ways to honor their memory. The law evolved to handle similar cases, and everyone involved carried the weight of what happened. That weight never disappeared, never lessened, never became easier to bear. It just became familiar, part of the landscape of their lives. A permanent reminder that evil exists, that it sometimes wears a child's face, that loving someone doesn't guarantee they'll love you back, that trying to help can get you killed, that justice requires hard choices, and that sometimes the hardest choice is acknowledging that a 14-year-old child can be a monster. The courtroom remained empty on that Tuesday afternoon, the chairs unused, the judge's bench waiting for the next case, the witness stand ready for the next testimony. Outside, the world continued. People went about their lives, most of them never thinking about what happened in that room decades ago. But the room remembered. Rooms always remember. And in the silence, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of a gavel striking, the sound of justice being served, the sound of a sentence that made history, the sound of a judge saying what needed to be said. You thought age would save you. You were wrong. The law doesn't care about your smile. It cares about your actions. And your actions demand consequences. 50 years worth of consequences. That's not cruelty. That's accountability. That's what justice looks like when mercy has no place left to stand. The gavel fell. The echo remained. And Marcus Chen would spend the rest of his life learning what his grandparents learned in their final moments. Some decisions are permanent. Some actions can't be undone. And sometimes the smile disappears forever. That was poetic justice. That was the end of the story. That was what happened when a 14-year-old thought he was smarter than everyone else and learned too late that he wasn't.